Emily stood at the edge of the grave. There was no strength to look down there. It hurt too much. She wouldn't see her Jason again. It was over. There were people standing around, some giving beautiful speeches. Others were crying, comforting Emily. At that, she had no more tears, her soul frozen. Emily looked toward where the tiny, neat graves of the angels stood. There her child, her flesh and blood, had been resting there for 9 years. Now husband and son would be together, and she had to get on with her life. Someone touched her shoulder. Emily flinched as if she'd been electrocuted. It was her mother-in-law. The unhappy woman mourning her son was unlike herself. Usually she was a proud, stern lady with a cold gaze. Now she looked like an old woman, pale, with accentuated gray strands poking out from under her black shawl. "Emily, how can it be? How can it be?" Barbara Jean repeated, clutching her sister-in-law's shoulders convulsively. Emily didn't know what to say. Jason's passing was predictable. He'd been very ill for the past 6 months. Cancer. The doctors had discovered the damn tumor late, and a young man in the prime of his life burned out like a candle. Of course, Barbara Jean knew of her son's illness and had been desperately searching the world for the best doctors, and Emily had looked too, but no one could help. Yes, this end was understandable, only still the pain. "Hold on, Barbara Jean," whispered Emily and hugged her mother-in-law. Actually, their relationship could not be called warm. Barbara Jean had never liked her daughter-in-law, but shared grief brought them closer together, and so the two of them stood together. The gravediggers had already finished their work. The two women stood as if glued together. Finally, someone took them under their arms and led them away from the cemetery. Then a painful wake. It was only in the evening, when she found herself in her own home, that Emily collapsed exhausted on the couch. Surprisingly, she felt better now. Yes, she was terribly tired, but it was still easier. No more of this constant pain, the hassle, the doctors. It was all in the past. And Barbara Jean, thank God, had gone to her apartment. Emily invited her over as a courtesy. It's a good thing she declined. Yes, she felt sorry for her as a mother, but there was still some coldness between them. Lying on the couch, Emily thought back over her life with Jason, their history of dating. It had all happened 11 years ago. Then at the student disco, her friend Ashley's screams were approached by 2 guys. It was immediately obvious that they were high-flying people, not unlike their dorm room boyfriends. They introduced themselves as Kyle and Jason. "We had a bunch of acquaintances at the party, but they were kind of boring," Kyle said, smiling. "I guess these beautiful girls are bored too. Shall we dance?" He looked at Emily too. The girl's heart gave a little twinge. She'd liked Kyle at first sight. Tall, strong, black curls like pitch black. He reminded her of a gypsy. Emily later learned that his grandfather had actually been a gypsy. And Kyle later laughed that he'd stolen her at that disco. It was the ancestral roots. But that was later. But that night they danced, they laughed. They felt so good together, like they'd known each other forever. Jason and Ashley were trying to have fun too, but it was a bit of a struggle. Jason kept looking at Emily, and Ashley kept looking at his watch. Afterward, they walked the girls back to the dorm. They agreed to meet up this weekend. Emily and Ashley discussed their new acquaintance in their room, unable to sleep. "Oh, Ashley, I think I'm in love," Emily said as she fell asleep. "Kyle is so wonderful." "Don't get too excited," Ashley grumbled sleepily. "You realize that Kyle isn't an easy student. Jason told me that they were in business together. And where there's business, there's women. Take your time." "You sound like your grandmother right now," Emily laughed. "She also instructed me saying gold to gold, stick to gold, and we need to look for something simpler." Emily's firm and grandmother was right. Ashley said weakly and fell asleep. Emily just smiled. It seemed to her that things were going to be different for her. Ashley went to her aunt's house over the weekend, letting her know that this was more important to her. For some reason, she didn't feel like hanging out with Jason, which it turned out was falling out for her. Emily, on the other hand, was going on a date. The guys showed up alone. Of course, they were a little upset that the girl came without a friend, but still decided that no one canceled the date. So the 3 of them went to the cafe. Kyle and Emily kept looking at each other, smiling at each other. At some point, Jason realized that he wasn't there after all. So he left. He gave Emily a thoughtful look before he left. Only she didn't think much of it at the time. She and Kyle walked through the city at night. It was late fall, the snow was falling, and the street lights were burning brightly. And the young people were not cold at all, despite the bitter cold, because in their hearts love had already begun. And then their romance began to grow rapidly. Kyle would come over on weekends, they'd go out, then he'd take her back to his apartment, and Emily would lose her head. Ashley scolded her in vain, saying, "You have to start studying, it's 5th year, you have to write your diploma." "I'll write my diploma," Emily waved her off. Her friend just sighed and went to the library. And Emily only waited for meetings with her beloved. She already dreamed of getting married and living together in his beautiful apartment. Kyle was really wealthy, despite the fact that he was not yet 25. The young man did not hide that the startup capital for the business was given to him by his parents, who now lived abroad. Of course, and Jason invested in their common business. His parents were also quite wealthy. "Jason and I went to high school together, then college," Kyle told Emily. "He's the best friend ever." Emily nodded absently in response. To be honest, she didn't like Jason. At first he'd seemed slippery, devious. But since he was her lover's friend, she preferred to keep her opinion to herself. Sometime after New Year's Eve, Kyle suddenly became preoccupied with his studies, even scolded her for her frivolity. And so, under his pressure, Emily sat down to study for her diploma. "Kyle, I understand that a girl needs to stay out of the way right now." He tried to visit less often, only texting, "I love you." And Emily texted him back. And she missed him a lot. That made their rare meetings even more long-awaited and emotional. In May, Kyle had to leave for a long business trip. Before that, he and Emily had spent a wonderful night together, and then he'd flown out, promising to be back just in time for his thesis defense. He'd written it first, but then suddenly he'd gone silent. His phone went dead. Emily called Jason several times asking what was wrong with her friend. "Nothing." I guess he answered in surprise. "We call every day." "Why can't I get through?" "Is he blacklisting me?" Emily asked. "I don't know," Jason said and lowered his eyes. The girl realized he wasn't telling her something. "Tell me," she demanded. "You see, Emily, here's the thing. Kyle got married. He had a girlfriend before you. They had a fight. And then they met on his business trip. They got married a week ago. It wasn't even a wedding. He also said he was never coming back to this town again. He gave me all the rights to the firm." "That news hit me over the head," Jason admitted. Emily's eyes darkened. How could Kyle do that to her? She nearly fainted. It was a good thing Jason was there in time to pick her up. Then he carried her to the nearest bench, ran to get water, came back and said something to calm her down. Emily just cried. She couldn't believe that the man she loved could do such a mean thing to her, wipe his feet on her. Jason drove her to her dorm and told her she could always count on him. "What do you mean, count on?" Emily asked deftly, thinking on her own. "He wasn't like Kyle," Jason replied quietly and touched her hand lightly. "Emily, know that I'll always be there for you." Then he tried to kiss her, but she pulled away. "Don't," she said as she got out of the car. Back at the dorm, she let the tears flow again. Now Ashley was calming her down, telling her that she needed to get Kyle out of her heart. "We have graduation defense coming up. That's what's important right now. Who are you hurting if you fail? Just yourself," Ashley said. And Emily was able to pull herself together. For the next 2 weeks, she tried not to think about the pain Kyle had caused her. She studied hard for the exam, and on the due date, she passed. She seemed to have shed the weight of her problems, but thoughts of Kyle came back to her. Ashley, seeing this state of affairs, again began to convince her that everything in her life will still be love and family. "If I were you, I'd keep my eye on Jason," she said. "He's been looking at you like that since day one. I think he's the kind of man who would carry you in his arms. And now that the firm is all his, he's obviously going to have more money." "Jason?" Emily asked indifferently. "Why didn't you have an affair with him yourself? You had the chance, didn't you?" "He's not my type," Ashley said. "Think about it." Emily shook her head. She didn't want anything to do with Jason. She didn't want anything to do with Jason. To unwind, she went to the farewell party with her band. A couple of glasses of champagne and life seemed to take on new colors. She was having fun, dancing, laughing. Ashley, seeing that her friend was feeling better, was having a good time too. When they left the cafe well past midnight, Jason was waiting for them at the door, "What are you doing here?" Emily wondered. "Ashley called to pick you up." She shrugged. "No problem for me." Emily looked at her friend indignantly, and she suddenly lit up. "What's the big deal?" "It's late. We have a long way to go. And cab drivers at night are all kinds of things. And Jason's here. He's a friend of mine," she said quickly, then slapped herself on the forehead. "Oh, I forgot. I'm going with Christina." She ran to the car where her classmates were disembarking and got in. Emily didn't even have time to say a word to her, looking at Jason hesitantly. "Let's go," he smiled. Emily got into his car, and he drove her not to the dorm, but to his place. And she didn't mind. In the girl's peaceful mind, she had one desire: revenge on Kyle. The wedge, as they say. Yes, she woke up in the same bed as Jason this morning. Her first instinct was to run away, to hide, to forget everything that had happened that night. No, she didn't love Jason. She'd done everything just to spite Kyle. And now she felt unbearably ashamed. Maybe she would have left, but Jason wouldn't let her go. That same day, he'd confessed that he loved her. From the first time he'd met her. It had always been painful for him to watch Emily interact with Kyle. But he kept quiet because Kyle was his only friend. But now he's gone, and there's nothing stopping us from being together. "Yeah, I realize what happened tonight was just an impulse on your part. But trust me, I'll make sure you never cry again," Jason whispered to her. "Yes, you don't love me now, but that will change. You'll see." And Emily believed him. The next day, Jason took her to meet his mother. Barbara Jean grinned at the girl and shrugged. She said, if that's the way her son wants it, he can date whoever he wants. "So you're a teacher?" she asked Emily as they sat down to dinner. "Yes, I graduated this year," she said shyly. She was uncomfortable in the company of this woman with cold eyes and an icy smile. It was clear that Jason's mom didn't like her. 1,000 times she wanted to leave. And only Jason's reassuring smile stopped her. Barbara Jean repeated, "An educator. And you plan to work in a school?" "Of course, dear, I don't think so." Jason cut into the conversation. "My wife won't be working. I can support my family on my own." Emily looked at him in surprise. Jason was proposing to her like that. She only blushed as they drove away from Barbara Jean. The girl wondered what this was all about. This dinner with her mom, these words he'd said about family. "To the fact that we're going to the registry office tomorrow," Jason replied with a smile. "And don't think my mom didn't like it. She's just a very tough person. Life has made her that way. You see, my dad died in the 90s. My mom had to run things alone. It wasn't easy. That's what makes her character so ironclad." "So your dad died?" "I'm sorry, you didn't tell me before." "Yeah, I didn't, because the subject is too painful. My only relatives are my mom and my grandfather on my father's side. He lives in the capital, is very rich and old. But I think he'll come to our wedding." "Jason, I can't do that," Emily blushed. "You and I haven't done anything together at all. And you're talking about a wedding? That's not right." "Right, baby. Trust me," Jason replied with a smile. And Emily decided to trust. Yes, Jason seemed trustworthy to her. And even though she didn't have any feelings yet, she still would. A month later, they had a lavish wedding at a fancy restaurant in the city. Numerous guests, toastmaster, photographer. This intricate kaleidoscope was spinning before Emily's eyes. For some reason, she felt so sick, nauseous, and dizzy. At some point, she lost consciousness and went outside for some fresh air. Ashley hurried after her. "Why are you so pale?" she asked Emily anxiously. "I don't know. I don't feel well," the bride admitted. "Girlfriend, are you pregnant?" Ashley asked. And those words struck Emily like an electric shock. Indeed, something had been going on with her lately. How could she not think about it? It was just so much going on. Emily only smiled weakly, shaking her head. But that thought was now keeping her on her toes. When would it all be over? To be honest, Emily felt like a bit of a stranger at this party. After all, among the guests and acquaintances, there was only Ashley, the grandmother, who raised Emily since childhood. Her parents did not come to the wedding because of their age. The girl almost did not remember. They died when she was still a little girl. All the other guests were Jason's co-workers, friends, and acquaintances. Of course, Kyle wasn't there. He was no longer in their lives at all. But his grandfather from the capital had come to the wedding, Jason said. He was probably even older than Emily's grandmother in age, but he was holding up well, though he could see he was griping. Nicholas Stevenson approved of his grandson's choice, wished them happiness, even hugged his bride and said that now it was possible to die, only to see great-grandchildren. The old man smiled slyly. Emily blushed. Jason assured his grandfather that they were working on it, which made the bride blush even more. Barbara Jean, on the other hand, was emphatically cold to her daughter-in-law, making it clear that this was not the kind of daughter-in-law she'd dreamed of. But since her son had fallen in love, what could be done? And after the wedding, just the next day, Emily ran to the clinic. And then she got a shock. Yes, the pregnancy is 12 to 13 weeks, the doctor informed her. Didn't you even suspect anything? Nothing, Emily admitted. I'm having this spring and summer. So many events, graduation, then a wedding. Oh, and those lady things irregularly. But the nausea in the mornings, the change in taste. Yeah, it's been fine, Emily shrugged. Except that it's been kind of uncomfortable since a week. But nothing. Everything is basically normal, the doctor reassured her. You'll take the tests now, and we'll keep the pregnancy going. Emily's voice trembled. Doctor, is there nothing that can be done? Not anymore. The doctor looked at the girl sternly. You should have come earlier. You'll calm down and accept everything as it is. Get used to the idea that soon you'll be a mom and go home. Make your husband happy. Emily walked to the bus stop with the doctor's words still in her head. Make your husband happy, but with what? The due date, because it was Kyle's baby. And there was no way to hide that fact. It was clear that Jason would divorce her now. Yeah, she wouldn't hide anything. She'd be honest about it. Jason frowned and thought about the pregnancy, then suddenly said he needed to be alone. He just took off and went somewhere. And Emily cried all evening. She was already painting her future life in dark colors. Now divorce, then she's a single mom. In all likelihood, she'd have to move in with her grandmother, because she had no place to live and no job in the city. Yes, the grandmother will be very upset that the granddaughter, as they call it, without a husband gave birth. After all, this marriage is just a bluff. Although you can hide from the old lady that there was another man. No, Emily was not going to lie to the closest person in the world, her grandmother. When the phone rang, Emily was about to pack her suitcase, certain that Jason would kick her out when he got back. It was Ashley. Emily didn't have to hide anything in front of her friend. What a twist. Ashley gasped. Kyle is such a bastard, he's ruined your whole life. Look, Emily, don't get too excited. Maybe Jason will accept the baby. After all, you didn't cheat on him. He knew about Kyle. That's just the way it is. What can you do? Besides, Jason loves you so much. Will he forgive me? Emily just sighed in response. How could she accept that? And no matter how much Jason loved her, it was hard to love another man's child, even a former friend. But the sad thing was, Emily realized that she already loved Jason herself, and to break up with him now would be very painful. Jason arrived at night even more pensive than when he'd left. He was silent for a long time. Emily kept silent too, because she knew that everything depended on her husband. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. Jason, I'm almost packed, she said. I'll leave tomorrow, and you won't hear from me again. Why the suitcase? He asked melancholically, thinking of something else. I'm going away tomorrow, Emily repeated. You don't have to go anywhere, he said. He walked over to Emily and took her hand. I've thought of everything. The baby's already here. Then so be it. Emily, I will accept this child and I will never reproach you for anything. I love you. Jason, she whispered. I didn't expect to hear that. She threw herself around his neck. Jason hugged her, and they made up. The newlyweds agreed not to tell anyone. It's their baby together, period. It was that night that Emily realized just how much Jason loved her. He didn't just talk about it anymore. His actions were much more telling. Soon every one of Jason's friends and co-workers knew about Emily's pregnancy. It never occurred to anyone that there was anything wrong. Yes, Jason had introduced Emily to everyone not too long ago. So what? They've known each other a long time. But no one thought about Kyle. I mean, when Emily was dating him, nobody even knew she existed. And only Barbara Jean pressed her lips together as she stared at her sister-in-law's growing belly. And though Jason assured Emily that her mother was out of the loop on everything, it seemed to Emily that wasn't the case. It could have been the nerves of pregnant women, though, because they were often nervous. The pregnancy was going well. Emily saw the doctors regularly and followed all their recommendations. She and Jason were told they were having a boy, an heir. Then Jason smiled. Ben Brown would be pleased. Grandpa never came to visit again. He'd been very ill for months. The great-grandchildren let him know. One day the old man called Emily and said that now he could die in peace. "What are you, Ben Brown? You'll still have a great-grandson to babysit," Emily objected. "There, Jason, you will surely get better." But Ben Brown died when Emily was 7 months pregnant. And soon after, Grandma Nina died as well. This string of deaths alarmed Emily, but Jason comforted her. They are elderly people. They all have their time on this earth. Jason then flew to Washington, D.C. for the reading of the will. And what was Emily's surprise when she learned that Ben Brown had left all his property to Jason? Though who else could he have left it to? Jason was his only grandson by his only deceased son. It didn't take long for Jason to decide to move to the capital. Emily was hesitant to move now, because she was about to give birth, and it would take time to get used to the new place. But Jason convinced her that Ben Brown's mansion was in perfect condition. It had all the servants, and the old man's business was afloat. "We've got to stop at the helm now, or the managers could do a lot of things," he said. "And in the capital, the medicine is top-notch. My mom is coming with us too. She will live in her grandfather's apartment on the other side of town. She'll only come to visit us. Nothing will change. By the way," she said, "a good friend of hers works at the perinatal center as head doctor, so you'll have the best labor possible." Emily realized she would just have to listen to her husband. Of course, it was a little scary to leave the city where she had lived for many years, but it was a long way to the capital. When Ashley heard about her friend's imminent move, she was thrilled. "Emily, do you realize that you and Jason have drawn the lucky ticket?" "No, girlfriend, I'm starting to bite my elbows that I didn't hook up with that handsome guy at the disco," Ashley said jokingly. "Hey, now I'll have to search our swamp, work at school for pennies, and wait for some millionaire to knock. Don't worry, you'll find your prince too," Emily laughed. She had already accepted the situation and was excited about the upcoming move as well, though she was worried, of course. "Yes, friend, I'll be waiting. What else can I do?" Ashley agreed. They promised each other not to get lost, to communicate often if possible, and to come visit each other. Soon both Emily and Jason and Barbara Jean left for the capital. The mansion in the capital was a veritable palace. Emily walked around it and marveled. "I'm the boss now." Jason was full of worries with the new business, so the future mother spent most of her time alone. A joyful discovery for Emily was that the mansion had a ready-equipped nursery. The servant said that it was the late owner ordered to do everything before leaving. He was so looking forward to a great-grandson. It's a pity did not wait. And soon the baby was to be born. Barbara Jean insisted that Emily be observed by her acquaintance, the one Jason had mentioned. Emily didn't argue. The head of the perinatal center was a good specialist, and she seemed very friendly. She explained to Emily when she needed to arrive at the birth center. It was just over 3 weeks away. Emily waited anxiously for that due date. One evening, Jason arrived home with Barbara Jean. She was surprisingly in good spirits, even smiling at Emily. "I bought a cake. We'll have tea." "Sure," Emily smiled confusedly. "Only I can't have sweets right now." "Oh, you can have some." Barbara waved her hand. "I have such a splendid excuse." "What is it?" Emily raised her eyebrows. "My son got me a new car." Barbara laughed happily. Jason only grinned, and Emily looked at her husband in surprise. Why hadn't he said anything to her about wanting to give her mother a present? Could she really have said something against it? "It was impromptu," Jason explained. Jason had just seen the exact car his mom wanted at the car dealership and bought it. Emily smiled politely. Well, Jason was free to use the money as he saw fit, but it was still a little annoying that he wasn't sharing his plans with her. The servants were out, though the table was set for dinner. "I let the maid and cook go early, and I wanted to take care of my husband during dinner," Emily explained. "Well, my dear, you're not in your position to carry the plates," her mother-in-law disapproved. "But I'm careful," Emily shrugged. "I'm pregnant, not sick." "Yes, you're right," agreed mother-in-law. After Barbara Jean made tea herself, Emily cut the cake, and then her mother-in-law remembered that she hadn't taken her evening pills. "Emily, dear, could you fetch my bag from the coat rack?" she asked. Jason was distracted by a work-related phone call, so Emily went to get the bag. She brought it over. Barbara Jean popped the pills, smiling gratefully at her sister-in-law. "Let's eat already," she said impatiently. "I'm so hungry." "Jason, you're coming." Jason returned to the table. "Emily, you taste the tea I made," smiled her mother-in-law. "I bought it today. It's a special tea, harvested by monks in Tibet." Emily smiled. "Monks, maybe?" laughed her mother-in-law. She was in a special mood that evening. "Can I have some of that tea?" Emily sniffed the liquid in her cup apprehensively. "I specifically checked with the salesman. He said it was especially good for pregnant women," she assured her mother-in-law. The tea was indeed delicious. It was probably the first time Emily had ever spoken so warmly to her mother-in-law. And after dinner, Barbara Jean even cleaned up the dishes herself. "Sit down and rest," she said to her daughter-in-law in a tone that brooked no objection. And Emily obediently agreed. It suited her. That evening it was decided that Barbara would stay the night. Everyone was getting ready for bed when suddenly Emily felt sick, a very bad stomach ache. "We must go to the hospital," Barbara commanded. "Let's go to Jane," she said. Emily, in pain, was willing to do anything but moo in response. Could this be labor? But why so soon? 3 more weeks. Jason carried her in his arms to the car. Barbara Jean sat next to Emily in the back seat, and they raced to the hospital. On the way, her mother-in-law was so caring, wiping the sweat from Emily's forehead, soothing her when she cried out in pain. And then suddenly Emily passed out. She woke up without realizing where she was. She saw a blurry picture before her eyes: white walls, white ceiling. A girl in a white robe was leaning over her. The image became clearer. Nurse. Emily heard a voice she couldn't make out at first. "Emily, how are you feeling?" "I'll get the doctor," she said. "My arms feel like cotton, my legs don't feel right, and my stomach is aching." The thought made me come to my senses completely. The baby. Naughty palms reached for her stomach, and her heart froze. The stomach was empty. Soon the same Jane Smith came to the room and explained everything to the girl. It turned out that Emily's placenta had detached. They had to operate. The baby couldn't be saved. Why was Emily crying? Everything was fine. Jane Smith explained that it happens sometimes and it's nobody's fault. "You needn't torture yourself. You're going to have children," she said softly. "Right now you need to recover, to regain your strength. You almost died yourself. You lost so much blood. You were unconscious for a week." "How long?" Emily couldn't believe it. "A week?" "Yes, a week," the doctor nodded. "The baby. We gave the body to the family. According to the rules of our clinic, we can't keep such biomaterial for a long time." "Biomaterial? What did you say?" Emily sobbed. "Was it a child? A human being?" "I'm sorry, honey." "Of course you're right." Jane Smith agreed. "I misspoke. But don't worry. As far as I know, Jason, Barbara Jean, the boy was already buried without you. You never got to see him." Emily cried. "Maybe it's for the best. I assure you it's better not to see it. Let that baby be only in your memory, your little angel. But it's going to get better. Now, nurse, I'm going to give you an injection and you'll get some sleep." And again she fell into oblivion. When she woke up, Jason was sitting next to her. He smiled. He stroked her hand gently. "Jason is my darling," Emily whispered. "We buried him. Sweetheart, don't cry. I didn't even get to say goodbye to him. When you get better, we'll go to the grave with you. Sweetheart, we'll have everything together. And we'll have children too." He kissed her hands, spoke words of comfort. Emily only cried. The pain never seemed to leave her. And at the same time, she was so grateful to Jason, who was so attentive and gentle. And he, too, was genuinely moved by the loss of the baby, even though he wasn't his by blood. Barbara Jean had also stopped by the hospital a couple times. She, too, spoke words of sympathy, tried to encourage, but all her words were artificial. For some reason, Emily didn't believe her. One day she asked Jason if his mother knew who her baby was from. His husband rounded his eyes and assured her that he'd never even given his mother a hint that Emily wasn't carrying his child. Yes, he sounded sincere. And Emily decided that Barbara Jean was simply incapable of any show of affection. She just didn't like Emily. I can't help it. When she was discharged, the first thing the poor young woman asked for was a ride to the cemetery to visit her son. Standing over the tiny mound, Emily felt empty. as if she'd been turned inside out. Her heart ached, but there were no more tears, only pain. A small mound, a small cross without even a plaque. That's all there is. Now I have a place where my baby rests, she said faintly. I didn't even have time to name him. I named him. Jason's voice came to her. I had to get the papers for the burial. I named him Kyle. Kyle? Emily flinched. I'm sorry I didn't consult you, but I thought it was the right thing to do. I gave him my middle name and told my mother that I named him in memory, in honor of my friend. So be it. Emily said humbly. Honey, you hang in there. Everything will work out. Don't worry that it's just a cross for now. I'll put up a beautiful headstone in a year, and we'll visit our baby. We'll never forget him. We won't, Emily echoed. And they walked away. They had to get on with their lives. As time passed, the pain receded. Emily stayed at home at first, doing chores. In a series of days, the pain did recede. About 6 months later, Emily was the first to talk about getting a job. I have a teaching degree. I could work in a school or in some kind of center of additional education. Why? Jason asked her mockingly. Don't I make enough money? But I can't stay inside 4 walls. You see, I need some kind of development. My wife should stay at home. Jason answered her sharply, and that was his final word. In vain. Afterward, Emily brought up the subject of work many times. Jason was adamant. Jason in general had become more rigid over time. It was just his opinion, period. Emily must have broken down after the baby. She was completely subservient to him. She stayed home, gardened, cooked. Ashley, who they now only spoke to on the phone, laughed that Emily should have gone to culinary school. Why had she spent so many years behind textbooks, studying foreign literature and Latin? Old Slavonic. Emily didn't take offense at her friend, and sometimes thought her joke wasn't such a joke. The young woman more and more often and again came to mind the idea of opening their own business. Let it be a small cafe, where there is always fresh baked goods, delicious tea and coffee. It needed money, and Jason gave her only for small expenses and no investment in his wife's business. 5 years passed. During that time, Emily began to notice how Jason was getting farther and farther away from her. He was working late at work, traveling frequently. He often spent his weekends at the office too. At least that's what he said. For some reason, Emily believed him because she loved him now. She felt like Jason was the main man in her life, believed and listened, and he took advantage of that. Jason had complete control over her. He even forbade Ashley from coming to visit. He said it was because she was out of their league. Ashley had visited Emily only once, after she had lost her baby. Jason had treated her coldly, as if he'd never met her before. And Ashley realized she'd better not show up at that house again. You better come see me, friend, she said to Emily as she left the cab. Emily promised but never went. In all that time, she didn't feel like arguing with her husband. After all, he had become a close person to her. As time went on, she began to think again about her and Jason trying to have a baby. Her husband didn't mind. But nothing worked. Emily went to all the doctors. All they could do was throw up their hands. There was nothing wrong with the young woman's health. The doctor at the fertility center said she should bring her husband. But Jason, just hearing that he should get checked out too, was very indignant. There's nothing wrong with me, he yelled. If you're not capable of giving birth anymore, you don't have to put your guilt on me. Jason, what is my fault? Emily meekly asked. Is it that you shouldn't have dragged around everyone before you were married? How can you do that? Emily almost cried. You know perfectly well that I've only had one man before you. And do you know what happened then? Jason answered nothing to that, only glared and retreated to his office where he sat late into the night, working. Emily eventually began to wonder if he had someone. She scrutinized his shirts for foreign female hair, lipstick, the smell of perfume. But nothing. Once she'd even gotten into his cell phone, but she hadn't found any strange correspondence. And then she saw them together, Jason and this long-legged blonde. That afternoon, Emily came out of the store where she'd gone to get ingredients for her new super pie. They appeared on the porch of the restaurant across the street, walking hand in hand, chatting sweetly about something. Then they got into her husband's car and drove off. And Emily also saw the damsel kiss Jason. and he gently stroked her permanent hair. Of course, the woman thought nothing more of the pie. She had been crying and angry with her husband for the rest of the evening. Several times she wanted to pack her things and leave. Where would she go? She doesn't have a corner of her own. Even the house in the village, where she used to live with her grandmother, burned down not so long ago. Then she decided that no, she would not go anywhere. She is a legal wife and will fight for her husband. She has no intention of hiding the fact that she saw him with his mistress. And as soon as Jason arrived home, Emily immediately told him everything. "Yeah, it's even my favorite woman," Jason said with a chuckle. "She works in one of the departments in my firm." "So, what else do you ask?" "Jason, have you no shame?" Emily shouted indignantly. "Are you cheating on me? I'm a man, I'm allowed to. And your place is to stay at home, take care of the coziness, and bake pies." "I can't believe you're telling me this," Emily said in shock. "I mean, you swore your love to me. You said I'd never regret marrying you." "Oh my God," Jason laughed. "What passions? Why, you want to know I never loved you, and I married you because I had to." "To whom?" Emily asked, confused. "To my grandfather, for crying out loud." And Jason, also looking at Emily, told her with a chuckle that Ben Brown had made a strange will a year before he died, telling his grandson all his property. Upon his death, it would go to Jason, but only if he married while Ben Brown was still alive. The old man was very worried that his grandson has a windy character, and he can just like that and live a bachelor all his life. At that time, Jason did not have a suitable girlfriend. Barbara Jean insisted he had to marry someone, and then Emily came along. "Who knew you were pregnant?" he muttered. "But you owe me to the end of your life that I didn't put you out on the street with a potbelly as soon as Grandpa died. What kept you from doing that later?" Emily looked at her husband without stirring. This story shocked her. She didn't want to believe it was true. But Jason clearly wasn't making anything up. "Why didn't you divorce me after Grandpa died?" "Because he's a creep. He made one condition: I had to still be married at the time I inherited. That's all. And then later I felt sorry for you." Jason grinned again. "You know, it's comforting to have someone waiting for you at home, like a faithful dog." "You mean I'm a dog to you?" As hard as Emily tried, she couldn't hold back the tears. "Do you think I'm going to live with you after this?" "Oh, just don't get all sentimental." "I don't care," Jason indifferently replied. "By the way, I'm not going to give you a divorce anyway. And you know why? I'm happy with everything right now. Besides, married status matters to me." "What about your Dana?" "Marry her." "Why?" "I'm comfortable that way. You are too, by the way. If you leave, you'll leave with nothing. There's nothing of yours here. So go on baking your pies, helping the servants. In fact, you're as much a servant as they are." And he left, chuckling, into the study. And Emily cried most of the night, realizing she'd fallen into a trap. Jason hadn't exaggerated. In a divorce, she'd be left with nothing. So Emily decided to endure it. She locked her heart away, hid her emotions, and continued to live like a robot. And so it went on for several years. During that time, Emily and Jason lived as neighbors. He was often out of the house at night, spending time with another mistress. After Dana, there was some Julia, then Chloe, then Jennifer. Jason would mockingly tell his wife who he spent the next night with. He enjoyed seeing his wife's face change from blushing to pale, biting her lip. Yes, Emily tolerated everything. She realized that it was necessary to take some steps, just run away from this tyrant who destroyed her morally, but where there was still nowhere to go. Ashley got married and left with her husband somewhere in the Far East. And Emily had no other close people. She hadn't made a single friend in all those years, because her husband was indifferent to her, but he made sure she didn't socialize with anyone, and the servants kept their distance from her mistress because Jason wanted them to. Barbara Jean didn't get any closer either. Emily thought she was becoming more and more like Baba Yaga as the years passed. No, her mother-in-law looked spectacular on the outside, but her character was getting tougher and meaner. When she visited, she often reminded Emily of the loss of her child and her infertility. Emily had long ago resigned herself to the idea that she would never be a mother. But thank God, Barbara Jean's words hurt her anyway. And then it happened. Jason stopped harassing her. He went to the hospital, and it was discovered that he had tumors in his brain. At first, he couldn't believe it. He went to many specialists, but no one could help him. Jason handed everything over to Sergei, the manager, when things got tough. He spent most of his time in his library. Barbara Jean had practically moved in with him, trying to cheer her son up. Emily suddenly felt sorry for Jason. She forgot all his abuse and tried to be a caring and attentive wife. "Why are you waiting for my son to die?" her mother-in-law would say on occasion. "You know you'll get nothing here." "Barbara Jean, how can you do that?" Emily shook her head. "Jason's still alive, and you're already dividing up the property." Barbara Jean pressed her lips together. Of course, Emily had been thinking about the inheritance. What could she hide? After consulting with a lawyer, she knew she'd be left with nothing unless Jason made a specific will. Whether or not there was a will, Emily didn't know. His lawyer was as silent as a wall. She didn't dare ask her husband. It would be a hint of his imminent death. Jason grew weaker and weaker. Eventually he collapsed, and Emily had to spend most of her time with her husband, nursing him back to health. He was in a lot of pain, couldn't speak very well. He looked Emily in the eye for a long time. She could see that he wanted to say something but couldn't. Several times Jason touched his wife's hand and mooed. "I'm sorry," she heard him say. Then he seemed to get better, even able to sit up on his own, talking better. He even began to communicate with the superintendent, giving him instructions. Emily thought that maybe the disease had receded. But the doctors were adamant these are temporary improvements, after which comes the inevitable end. One day Emily went out for a couple of hours. She wanted to get away from the dreary atmosphere of the house. She went into town, walked along the seafront, and when she returned she heard Barbara Jean's angry voice. She was shouting from the bedroom where Jason lay. "Are you out of your mind?" shouted the mother at her sick son. "What the hell are you thinking? Don't you dare do that." All that was heard in response was some mumbling. When Emily entered the bedroom, her mother-in-law was hovering over Jason's bed. He lay staring at one point, unable to say anything as his condition worsened again. The behavior of Barbara Jean, who all this time was very worried about her son's illness, was incomprehensible to Emily. She wants to finish him, or what? "What's going on here?" Emily asked. Her mother-in-law flinched when she heard her voice. She turned around. "Nothing," she mumbled and walked out of the bedroom. Emily noticed that she was too pale, her hands shaking. Jason was still staring at the same spot. "Jason, what happened?" Emily asked her husband, but it was as if he hadn't heard her, still staring at the same spot. Then suddenly he screamed terribly. Emily called an ambulance. By morning it was over. Jason was dead. And his death somehow reconciled the two women, Barbara Jean and Emily. The daughter-in-law comforted her mother-in-law, supported her. Barbara had suddenly aged a lifetime, and Emily had nothing but emptiness in her soul. And now, after Jason's funeral, Emily pondered how she should go on with her life. Whatever she had with Jason, she was used to being married all the time. Now she would have to make her own decisions. Jason's self-determination had destroyed her. The morning after the funeral, Emily woke up with a high fever. Then she started coughing up a terrible cough. I had to call an ambulance. She was immediately taken to the hospital. In the hospital, after all the examinations, after 24 hours, it turned out that it was just a severe bronchitis apparently. She caught a cold at Jason's funeral. Emily was discharged with further treatment. She took a cab home without telling the maid or her mother-in-law. She didn't call, though she'd checked on her health the night before and told Emily to report the results of her checkup. Such care surprised her, but she did not think much of it. And in the living room she saw Barbara Jean's jacket carelessly tossed on the couch. "Oh, you're back?" Laura, the housekeeper, came into the living room. "Why didn't you tell me? You didn't cook dinner, did you?" "It's nothing," Emily replied. Emily shook her head and pointed to her mother-in-law's jacket. "Barbara Jean is here." "Yes, she arrived this morning," the girl said worriedly, angry as a fury. She dropped the jacket and ran on. First she was in the library looking for something, and now she's gone into the bedroom of her dead master. Emily frowned and went into the bedroom. When she entered, Barbara Jean was standing by the bed with her back to the door, stuffing something into a bag on the mattress. "Hello, Barbara Jean," Emily said loudly. Hearing her voice, her mother-in-law flinched. She obviously didn't expect to see her sick daughter-in-law here. "Emily, have you been discharged yet?" she said quickly, turning around. She grabbed her bag awkwardly from the bed, and the contents flew to the floor. Some kind of paper fell at Emily's feet. Her mother-in-law shrieked and tried to pick it up, but the sheet was closer to Emily, and she deftly picked it up. It was a will. So Jason had made one after all, and hidden it in the room. "Give it back." The mother-in-law shrieked in anger. "No, wait. I'll read it if I can get my hands on it." "Don't you dare." The mother-in-law tried to pull the will out of Emily's hands, but she failed. She stumbled and collapsed on the bed. Emily left the bedroom at a brisk pace to study it in peace, went to the library, locked herself in, read. And what she learned from the will raised a lot of questions. It appeared that Jason had bequeathed all his property and business to a 9-year-old boy named Eli John, and Emily was to be in charge of everything until he came of age, and a decent bank account. But that seemed to be the end of it. Everything had been drawn up in front of a notary shortly before Jason's death, just the day before he died, Emily calculated. The day she'd gone for a vacation and returned to find Barbara Jean in a rage, yelling something to her sick son. That's when he got worse. But what was this strange will? Who was this boy? Emily sat at her desk in thoughtfulness, not knowing what to do now. There was a furious pounding at the door. It was Barbara Jean. Emily stashed the will in her desk drawer, locked it shut, and opened the door. Her mother-in-law burst in like a fury. She yelled something, nonstop, about how Emily was a pauper and she would get nothing, about how she took advantage of her son and so on. "You think your puppy's going to get everything? No way. He had nothing to do with Jason's money." The mother-in-law shouted and then stopped talking, realizing she'd said something unnecessary. "What about my puppy?" Emily said quietly. "Who is the boy in the will?" "No one," the mother-in-law said, her head down. "The son wrote the will when his consciousness was already disturbed. He dreamed something. Probably. And the notary is a fool and a scoundrel. He notarized something he shouldn't have. I can easily prove in court that Jason was insane when he wrote that will." "Is that why you were yelling at him?" Emily guessed. "Yeah, I couldn't help it. I arrived and bumped into the notary Jason had called. I found out about the will while you were out and demanded that he hand it over. It's a piece of paper, but it puts me, the rightful heir to everything, out of business." Jason suddenly went into a kind of stupor. "And you started yelling?" Emily shook her head. "Do you realize that your behavior is probably to the end of your son?" "Don't you dare accuse me." Barbara Jean arched her back. "Give me the will, and I won't think of it. I now have to find out who this boy of 9 named Eli is." Emily answered her calmly. And at once a terrible conjecture rushed into her face and pierced her mind. 9 years old. He was born on January 5th. My son was born on January 5th. What does that mean? What the hell were you thinking? Mother-in-law muttered. Nonsense. I'm telling you, Jason wasn't himself. That's why he wrote that nonsense. And yet, Barbara Jean, I can see that you're not telling me the truth, Emily said thoughtfully. Who is this boy? Are you out of your mind too? Shrieked the mother-in-law. With these words, she flew out of the library. In a minute, she was gone from the house. Emily continued to sit in the library. She took out the will again, reread it, and then called the notary. He confirmed that he had indeed notarized the will. Jason insisted that it stay at home. He wanted Emily to find it after he died, read it, and decide what to do with it. If she doesn't find it, then so be it. I don't know what to do, Emily admitted. I can't understand what child the will is talking about. To be honest, I don't know either, the notary answered. But besides the will, Jason dictated to me the letter he left for you. It is in my safe. I have to give it to you on condition that you already know about the will. You can come to my office and read it. All right, I will, Emily agreed at once. Laura had urged her in vain to get some rest after her discharge from the hospital. Bronchitis was a serious matter, but Emily, having taken her medicine, called a cab. Why a cab? Laura lamented. Jason's driver hadn't been fired yet. He called this morning to ask about you. Let him drive you. By the time he got from his house, a cab would be faster, Emily said. In the cab, she thought sadly that she'd become, frankly, worthless during the years she'd lived with Jason. He had completely suppressed her desires and aspirations. After all, she'd dreamed of learning to drive a car and getting her driver's license when she was young. None of that happened. She lived under her husband's power as if under hypnosis. The notary was waiting for her, As soon as Emily entered the office, he immediately pulled out a letter and held it out to her. "You can read it here or later, when you feel you need to," he said. "Not here, I think." "Thank you." Emily took the envelope with trembling hands and left the office. She walked to the park and sat on a bench. She wanted to read the letter without witnesses, because she knew that it would reveal a truth she vaguely knew. This truth was so terrible that it did not fit her mind. The woman opened the envelope and began to read. Jason was writing himself, his handwriting jumping. Apparently his hand had been shaking when he wrote the letter. Probably took advantage of being alone and feeling better. "Emily, if you're reading these lines, then you know about the will. This boy is Eli John, your son by you and Kyle. Yes, I once told you the truth, that I married you because of the terms of my grandfather's will. But I didn't tell you the most important thing. Is your son alive? His mother put something in your tea. It caused you to go into labor. She arranged for a friend at the clinic, Jane Smith, to make sure your son was stillborn. The baby was dropped off at an orphanage in the region. You were kept on medication for a week to keep you awake. And then we told you we'd already buried the baby. There's no one in that grave, just a headstone on top. I did it because the mother didn't want a stranger's child in our family. And I agreed with her because I didn't think I could accept him, even though I told you otherwise. I'm sorry. 2 years ago, I found out I was infertile. With the help of the detectives, I found the boy. At first, I just wondered how he was doing. Now that I'm dying, I realize I missed my chance. After all, I could have been a father and we would have been fine. And that was it." Jason was still trying to write something, but it was illegible. Emily sat dumbfounded, rereading the letter several times and unable to realize whether it was joy or grief in her soul. The child she had mourned for 9 years was alive, and her mother-in-law and husband had deliberately deprived her of the joy of motherhood. At the same time, they lied to her face, expressed hypocritical sympathy. How despicable. Tears sprang from her eyes. She imagined her son, who grew up in the state walls, not knowing his mother's affection and care. What he looked like, what he was interested in, what he thought about. It was painful to realize that her boy considered her a traitor. After all, in his opinion, he probably thought his mother had abandoned him. She wanted so badly to press him to her breast, hug him, and never let him go again. But where to find him? There was no mention of him in the letter. So Emily went to the notary again. He wasn't even surprised to see her at the door. "Kevin Davis, you'll be able to help me, won't you?" she said. "We need to find the boy to understand him." He nodded in response. "I know the contents of the will. I don't know who you think he is, though, do you?" "He's my son," Emily replied in a choked voice, and told him everything briefly. The notary only shook his head as he listened to the woman's rambling story. "I never thought that your husband could have done such a thing to you," he sighed after listening to her. "Even under pressure from his mother, he had no right to do that. And you realize you have a legal right to go to the police now. Barbara Jean must answer for the atrocity she committed." "I will, but first help me find the boy," Emily pleaded. "I want to see him first." "I don't think you'll be allowed to talk to him until the police get to the bottom of this. But I'll help you, of course. I don't think it won't be too difficult, because we have all the data on him," the notary promised. Emily left the notary's office a little cheerful. Already in the cab on the way home, she asked the driver to go to a different address. She wanted to look her mother-in-law in the eye. Barbara Jean opened the door for her. The women looked at each other in silence. "Why are you here?" At last the mother-in-law asked in a muffled voice. "I want to hear from you how you took my child away from me and made me believe he was dead. Why did your face change so much? I know everything. Jason left me a letter confessing that you drugged my tea and caused me to go into premature labor. And then you and your friend covered it up," Emily said. "Don't talk nonsense," Barbara Jean whispered. "You don't have to put on a show in front of the neighbors. Then let me into the apartment. I have something else I want to say to you." Come in. Her mother-in-law took a step back, and Emily stepped into the apartment. "So you're saying I'm crazy? I'll go to the police tomorrow and file a report against you. It will be easy to prove that I'm right," Emily continued. "I wonder how," grinned her mother-in-law. "I will demand the exhumation of the child's body. There's nothing left there after all these years. But I'll find something, if there was something there." They both spoke sharply, looking angrily into each other's eyes. After Emily's last words, her mother-in-law stammered, turned pale, then cried. "How can you accuse me of anything? You have no conscience. I just buried my son," she said. "Now, do you understand how I felt when they told me my child was dead?" Emily replied, "How dare you compare? Because that one was a baby. He was just born. You didn't raise him. You didn't nurture him. You didn't give him a soul. A baby. That's how you talk about my baby? It's your fault I didn't raise him. So you believed a sick man's letter?" Jason wasn't in his right mind anymore. The mother-in-law began to push her line again. "We'll see about that," Emily glared, then left Barbara Jean's apartment. She returned home and lay in bed for the rest of the day. Emily could no longer cry or think, as if her soul had been taken out of her. Then her fever rose again and her cough worsened. Laura brought her tea and honey, which made her feel better, and Emily fell asleep. She woke up the next morning to a phone call. It was the notary. He had found the address of the orphanage in one of the orphanages of the region, in a small village. "Just, I beg you, don't go there right now. First of all, no one will let you go there. You'll only waste your nerves. And secondly, you were obviously unwell yesterday. You should get some treatment. And you should also go to the police," the notary advised. Emily listened to his words. It was necessary to get better. Her condition was really bad. She'd had a fever for 3 days. It was good that Laura was nearby, bringing medicines, preparing broths and concoctions. Finally, Emily felt better. The first thing the woman decided to do was to go to the police. She realized that this was the starting point in her whole tangled story. The investigator listened to her with disbelief, but Jason's letter interested him. It was only then that he told Emily to write a statement. "We'll do some investigative work, dump the paperwork from the clinic." The investigator shrugged. "But it'll be fine there. They're definitely backed up." Desperate, Emily shrieked. "Let's schedule an exhumation," the investigator added then. "Shall we go straight to the boy?" Emily asked hopefully. "No, there's no reason to right now," the man shook his head. "And I advise you to stay away from the orphanage for now. Understand, you can't traumatize a child." And Emily agreed with him. Of course, everything was perfect at the maternity hospital according to the paperwork. And then, as promised by the investigator, an exhumation was scheduled. Emily volunteered to go with the forensics team. After some hesitation, she was allowed to be there. At the cemetery, both the police and Emily were in for a shock. The burial site was uncovered. There was just a gaping hole and a stone angel lying around. Immediately, the cemetery staff was called in. They swore and swore that yesterday everything was still in order, and today no one had passed here yet. That's why they didn't notice such an outrage. The watchman assured them that he had not seen anyone suspicious in the cemetery and that everything was quiet at night. But the old man averted his eyes strangely, and it was not difficult for the experienced investigator to crack him. The watchman confessed that last night an elderly lady came to him in the gatehouse, brought a bottle of vodka, some delicacies, and even sat with him a little. No, she did not drink, but she treated the watchman generously. Toward the end, the old man did not remember how he fell asleep and woke up in the morning. "My guest was gone. Everything seems to be in place. I thought she was just a lonely woman, just dropped in for a visit. She wanted to make me happy, and I fell asleep like that." "It was a shame," said the watchman, sighing. He was scolded, of course. What's the use? It was clear that the woman had not just appeared in the gatehouse, and from her description she looked very much like Barbara Jean. So she was a distraction, and someone was at work at the grave. But there was no way to prove anything. There was hope that forensics would find something in the ground, but no luck, no trace. And then luck struck. Operatives surveyed the woods near the cemetery and came across a couple of homeless people who were feasting in a clearing, drinks and snacks. It was clear they'd spent a lot of money. In their pockets they found about 100,000 rubles. The homeless were immediately arrested, taken to the station, and demanded that they tell where they got the money from. They robbed someone, killed them. The investigators spoke harshly to them, and the homeless were frightened. They began to tell each other how yesterday afternoon some elderly woman came up to them and asked them to open the grave with the angel. "No, we refused at first. It's sacrilege," said one of the homeless. "She told us that the grave was a fake. Allegedly, her daughter-in-law gave her child to an orphanage a few years ago, and she herself created such a thing. She paid someone to build the grave. They were relatives. All this time they thought the child was gone. Recently, the old woman found out the truth. We have to teach her a lesson, uncover the grave, so the police can intervene. We did so, interrupted the second homeless man. Honestly, Citizen Chief, the grave was empty. Everything matched. They made a sketch of the homeless. Emily recognized her mother-in-law in the sketch. The police went to Barbara Jean's house, and Emily followed them again. She was no longer restrained because the police sympathized with this young woman who had been cruelly deceived by her relatives for so many years. Barbara Jean was at home when she realized why the policeman had come to see her. She tried to faint, but she failed. Then she started sobbing. It was all natural here, the tears flowed, but they had no effect on the investigator. Barbara Jean, you're under arrest, she was led away. Already at the police car, she turned sharply towards Emily and shouted, "You're all about the money. It's a start. What do you want with that child? All those years you've been living in peace, not needing anything. Using my son's money. Now you've decided to stand behind the coffin. Is money all you think about, Barbara Jean?" Emily replied with a shudder in her voice. "Your son's death doesn't even upset you. You're worried that you won't get his inheritance. And you won't get it, and the child will die," the old woman shouted and laughed hysterically. She was so hysterical that the police had to take her not to the station, but to the clinic. But Emily was not interested in that fact either. She waited for further investigation. And finally, the day came when she and the investigator went to the orphanage where Eli John lived. The head of the orphanage told her that the boy had been admitted from the hospital after being there for a month. That's how it's supposed to work. All this time, the police were looking for his grief-stricken mother, who abandoned the baby on the threshold of the shelter, but never found anyone. The boy was given that name because he was found on Saturday, and he was found by Eli John, the caretaker. He went outside for a quiet smoke. It was freezing out there. He saw a box on the doorstep, and in it a newborn boy wrapped in a thin blanket. Apparently, the one who planted it did not care much whether the child would survive or not. The baby was given the most Russian patronymic Ivanovich. True, over time we realized that he should have been given some gypsy patronymic, with a smile recalled the superintendent. And Eli is our John Ravenki. Well, pure gypsies. And how he sings like that, how he dances a real artist. Emily, listening to the story of the headmistress, quietly cried. And when she told the child's appearance, she even shrieked. Of course it was her boy. After all, Kyle had gypsy roots. "What's the matter with you?" The investigator frowned, looking at Emily. "Bad heart." No, Emily shook her head. "Please, can I see him?" But you realize you can't say anything to the baby, yet the supervisor gave Emily a stern look. "What if it's not your baby? We have to go through the DNA procedure." "I understand, I'll go through with it. Just let me look at him at least from afar," Emily begged. "Well, come on guys, it's just outside. You and I will walk down the path and I'll point out Eli. But please, no socializing for a while, because our children are very vulnerable. If your story doesn't hold up, we'll have to take the kid to counseling." Emily knew that the super was right about everything, so she just obediently followed her down the path. The children were noisy on the playground. Someone pulled up on the bar, someone kicked the ball, someone just leaned idly. And this boy was sitting on a bench, staring thoughtfully off into the distance. Emily realized at once that this was Eli, just as the headmistress had described him to her before. And then he looked toward the adult standing on the path, and his ornate, charcoal eyes met Emily's. What happened is unclear, but the boy suddenly snapped out of his seat, and with a cry of "Mommy," rushed toward her. He ran up to Emily so fast that he was not intercepted in time. Eli hung around the woman's neck, and she hugged him tightly. The superintendent and the teachers were stunned. Eli had never behaved like that before. After all, there were other adults coming in. He was always reserved, calm. What happened here? Did he feel his heart close to his own? It's mystical, isn't it? Emily thought nothing of it. She held the baby even tighter to her and whispered, "My baby boy. I won't give you to anyone." She no longer cared what the DNA test would show. It was her baby. But later, a DNA test confirmed it. Emily was Eli's birth mother. That day, the unbelievable happened. The orphanage workers were outraged, demanding that Emily leave the orphanage. They tried to pull Eli away from her, but he clung to the woman like a tick. Eventually, they gave up and let the boy stay with Emily. So Eli left the orphanage and never returned. Mother and son were now together. Now Emily and Eli's days were filled with joyful events. They were getting to know each other, socializing. And there were no happier people in the world. One day, Emily apologized to Eli. For what? The child wondered. Oh, for not looking for you all these years. I thought you were gone, Emily confessed, and tears rolled from her eyes. Mommy, you don't have to cry. The main thing is that we are together now. Eli answered her judiciously. I always knew that you did not leave me. I was just stolen. How did you know that? I can't tell you. I was just sure of it, Eli shrugged. Did you have a hard time at the orphanage, son? Emily asked cautiously. No, it was okay. No one hurt me. I've never known any other life, the boy said. Emily once again noted how wise the boy was. And then there was the trial. They tried Barbara Jean and her physician's assistant, Jane Smith. They also found those who helped make the false documents and the cemetery workers who made the false burials. They all got the punishment they deserved. Except that Barbara Jean went from the courtroom not to prison, but to a specialized clinic. She behaved inappropriately. Later, she was assigned compulsory treatment. And Emily, 6 months later, entered into legal inheritance rights. Now she could dispose of her late husband's property and his business. It was the business that kept her on her toes. She realized that this is not her field of activity, and she is unlikely to be able to competently manage it. After consulting with lawyers, she learned that she could sell the firm, although the will seemed to leave everything to Eli John. So she did. Emily put the bulk of the money into Eli John's account, and with the rest of the money she decided to open a bakery along with a cafe. It was her dream that finally came true. Emily bought a room, equipment, hired employees, and the business started. Very soon her bakery was in great demand among the population, and the cafe was always full of people. Emily decided to expand production. For this she needed new premises, and she found one in the center of the city. There were few competitors nearby. Only the owner of this building has long lived in another region. The premises were rented but not used. The tenants kept the building just in case, and Emily had been able to convince them to give up the lease. Now she needed to contact the landlord. The previous tenants had given her the contacts, and she nearly fainted when she read who the landlord was on the business card. It was Kyle, the one who had once betrayed her, abandoned her by marrying someone else. Emily was ready to give up on the new building, but the entrepreneurial excitement overcame all emotions. The woman decided that everything is in the past, although how in the past? Let the bastard know he had a son. No, Emily wasn't going to demand anything from him. Just talk about work issues first, and then tell him about the son. Anyway, the more she thought about it, the more she realized she might have to say goodbye to the extension. Now she just wanted to tell Kyle everything. Emily realized that even though it had been years, the resentment still lingered in her heart. Emily hadn't dared to call him for a long time, but one day she got up the courage to dial his phone number. Kyle answered almost immediately. Hello, Kyle. Don't you recognize me? He was quiet for a moment, then hesitantly said, Emily, is that you? It's unexpected. I didn't think I'd ever hear you like Jason again. He's dead. He's dead. I feel sorry for you. I guess I shouldn't be, though. What do you mean you shouldn't? Emily suddenly burst into a rage. No, of course you don't owe me anything. Not after you dumped me. Then I dumped you. Kyle shrieked. You were the one who gave me the horns with Jason. I had already bought the rings. I was on my way to see you when Jason called me and told me you were with him. Then he sent me a picture of you two together. What the hell is that? Emily was confused. It never happened. You went away on a business trip, and then Jason told me that you'd married some old love of yours, and I was always just a distraction for you. You never showed up again, and you gave the business to Jason. What do you think? It never happened. It didn't, Kyle answered just as confused. I've never been married. The business? Jason had just pushed me out of the business. I realized I didn't need to go back to the place where my fiancé cheated and my friend betrayed me. I just started a new business in another city, that's all. I don't believe you, Emily whispered. He was quiet for a while and suggested that they meet and discuss everything, looking into each other's eyes. Soon Kyle arrived at Emily's house. They met in the park, sat on a bench, and both realized that nothing between them was over. Their hearts were pounding frantically, their eyes staring into each other's eyes. Kyle recounted once again how Jason had lied to Emily. Of course, that picture was gone. Kyle had deleted it at once. He'd believed his friend then, and then he'd stopped considering him a friend when he'd essentially stolen from him. But Kyle had gotten over it, learned to move on, though he couldn't get over Emily for a while. At the time, he was trying to get a foothold in the capital city, bought this building. One day he saw Emily and Jason on the street, saw her, and his heart skipped a beat. And then he noticed the fading belly and realized it was definitely unnecessary. Forever. So he left to seek his fortune in another city. His business did well there, and everything's fine. Now he just lives alone. Emily explained how she'd started dating Jason, how her husband and mother-in-law had treated her meanly. "Kyle, when you saw me on the street with a belly, you got me pregnant," she said. "God, I'm such a fool." He slapped himself on the forehead. Believing some picture. It must have been a photo montage. It couldn't have been. Emily agreed. "Eli, you have no idea how much he looks like you." "Will you introduce us?" Kyle asked timidly. "Do you really want me to?" "Very much." "Then don't tell him who you are." Eli had been through enough emotional turmoil lately. "I understand," Kyle agreed. "Maybe I'll come over for dinner tonight then." "Come over." Emily dictated the address and rushed home. She'd forgotten all about the room that had started it all. Kyle was in front of her eyes the whole time. She remembered his eyes, his smile, heard his voice. Her son met her at home. "Mom, why are you so happy?" Eli asked. "Yeah," a little Emily laughed. "It's just the usual. Just a good mood, son. Good. By the way, an old friend of mine is coming to dinner tonight, a very old friend." "No, he's older than me, but not by much," Emily smiled. "It's just that we've known each other a long time, and we haven't seen each other for a long time. We ran into each other today, and I invited him over." I just shrugged. A guest is a guest. We'll see what they call it. And that evening, Kyle arrived with a bouquet of flowers and boxing gloves. When he saw Eli in the hallway, he was a little confused. Of course, Kyle couldn't help but notice how much his son looked like him. "Hello, Eli. My name is Kyle," he said, and held out the flowers to him. Then laughed, taking the bouquet aside. "Oh, sorry, these are for Mom, and this is for you. I don't know if I got the right size or not. We'll check." Eli said casually and immediately tried on the gift. The gloves were just right. Kyle handed Emily the bouquet. "White roses?" She smiled. "Do you remember how I never forgot that white roses were your favorite?" Quietly, he answered, and they stood looking into each other's eyes. Eli distracted the adults for a while, stared at them intently, and then suddenly said, "Mom, I think Kyle looks a lot like me." "That's my dad." The question confused them. Kyle was the first to realize. "Actually, you look a lot like me. Why don't we get reacquainted?" "Yeah, I'm your dad." And he held out his hand to Eli. The boy held out his gloved hand, visibly worried. Then suddenly Kyle scooped him up into his arms and hugged him tightly. "Son, I'm sorry it took me so long to get here," he said in a broken voice. "I'm glad you did," the boy answered him, and nuzzled his nose into Kyle's neck. Emily stood beside him and smiled. She also couldn't believe it. Had she been living in some kind of nightmare for so many years? After all, real life was just beginning. It wasn't long before Kyle and Emily were married. Eli now has a different last name and middle name. Jason's house Emily sold, and together with Kyle they bought another mansion. Kyle moved in with his sweetheart for good and is building a business here. Emily didn't have to buy the place she had in mind. Her husband gave it to her as a gift. Now her chain of bakeries and coffee shops is even more famous in the city. And they're doing well. Last summer just seems like a nightmare dream that is slowly letting go, but it can't be crossed out. It's with them forever. And the fact that the late Jason had bequeathed everything to Eli, too, sometimes bothered Emily. "Maybe I should have given up everything," she asked her husband. "Why do we need his money? And why Eli John? Why give it up? Jason bought his forgiveness so you'd forgive him. You did forgive him." "I did, but I didn't forget. You don't have to. I don't think Jason was a bad person, just influenced by his mother. So she molded him into a monster. And she paid for it, Emily agreed. And there are no more mean people out there. Now Kyle and Emily knew that if someone said something mean, they had to check it 1,000 times to make sure it was true. Because once you believe a lie, you can go off the path that fate has set for you. Ashley was always called Sunshine. From the moment she was born, the little girl seemed to light up everything around her. When she was brought from the hospital, put on the table and unwrapped diapers, the many neighbors who had gathered for the event in their house, amicably aghast. Unexpectedly, they laughed. The baby, lying in front of them and amusingly moving freed arms and legs, as if glowing. The baby's light skin was covered with light, barely visible freckles, making her less white. Oh, what if it's a disease? Olivia, the girl's mother, exclaimed hysterically. It's a rash, probably. How could they let you out of the hospital with such a disease? Olivia, stop screaming, you'll scare the child. The woman was shouted down firmly by the stately Emily, a mother of 5. Because of this, she was considered infallible in matters of health and education. It's not a rash. She scrutinized the baby. They're freckles. Your little redhead's like a dandelion. Emily was restrained in her emotions, but she smiled involuntarily, and the others smiled after her. The little girl, 5 days old, felt everyone's delight. Her eyes rounded, and her funny, wrinkled nose, as only babies can do, sneezed. On the top of her head, a strand of bright red hair tangled amusingly. On her temples and the back of her head, golden locks curled into amusing curls. Golden eyebrows and eyelashes completed the picture. Well, just a sunshine. Someone whispered admiringly. A sunny little girl. But only she got a bad mother, came a low voice from behind. A short, thin woman of about 50 strode resolutely through the crowd. Her thin hands, calloused from hard labor, deftly grabbed the little girl. You're all whispering and grumbling, she said. Come on, get out of here. There's nothing to frighten the child or jinx it. Come on, Barbara Emily said conciliatingly. The others admired the baby in silence, only sighing occasionally. It's worth it to see such a miracle. We seldom have anything that isn't dark as coal. And here is such a sunshine, laughed the other one quietly. That's just it, Barbara said angrily, shooing her neighbors away from the table. Go home, all of you, or I'll take a broom, and I'll spare your gray heads. Knowing her decisive temper, and the fact that she was not used to throwing words around, the women started to leave. Barbara locked the door and turned to the mother of the little girl, who had been sitting in silence all this time. Well, daughter, tell me, how are we going to live from now on? She shrugged her shoulders. As we lived before, so we will continue to live. No, the mother replied resolutely. You have a child now. You will not live as before. You don't tell me how to live, replied the daughter angrily. Can you do it without me? Barbara hesitated. There's your showdown lying there, waving its arms and legs. She waved her hand in the direction of the little girl, who was concentrating on her fingers. At the sight of the girl, her mother's angry, tense face instantly relaxed and blossomed. The deep wrinkles turned into rays that scattered to the sides. She approached the little girl and gently touched her tiny hands. The girl immediately grasped her grandmother's finger tightly. Barbara laughed softly and leaned toward her granddaughter, scrutinizing her. Her eyes lit up with tenderness. And she is a sunshine, she said with a soft smile. Our golden daughter. A redhead like her father, she said sharply. You can't find a golden one. These words brought Barbara back to reality. Barbara looked sharply at her daughter. Her face was hard and stern again, and her gaze was testing and distrustful. I'm not going to discuss your affairs. It's none of my business. But you brought your child into my home, and it's my granddaughter, she emphasized the last 2 words. Olivia, your daughter is your life now. And how are you going to live it? It's our business. It's mine too. So don't you dare talk to me like that. This is my home for now, and I own it. I knew it, Olivia said, gloatingly. I know that you'd reproach me for being your keeper. Barbara looked at Olivia regretfully and waved her hand tiredly. Come to the child, mother, she said. Why should I go near her? Her daughter shrugged her shoulder. She's not crying. So everything is normal. And so it turned out that all the care of the baby fell on the shoulders and hands of 55-year-old Barbara. Barbara was a very famous and notable person in the big noisy village. The girl is short and thin. Nevertheless, she never got lost in the crowd of her peers. Her large brown eyes, thick blonde braid, and cheerful, never dull character made up for her lack of height and stature. She was beautiful with a special, calm, sweet beauty, and modestly dressed, always busy with an inordinate number of younger brothers and sisters, always freckled in bunches. Barbara never had a shortage of suitors. After graduating from teacher training institutes, Barbara returned to her native village and began working as a math teacher in the only school. A few years later, Barbara, who by then had blossomed into a lush, truly feminine beauty, to everyone's amazement and indignation, married a stranger. A stranger, as they called him in the village. Alex came from the city to work as a technician at a large livestock complex, and according to the village critics, other than a diploma in his profession, there was nothing outstanding about him. Barbara and Alex loved each other very much. It was obvious to the naked eye, and their love was something unusual for these places, not country. Alex gave his wife bouquets of flowers, carried her bags from stores, and carried her through puddles on his hands, which made men indignant, and women in a timid awe. Barbara wasted her hands washing his shirts by hand and rushing home from school in time to prepare a delicious dinner. Crazy people. What can you take from them? Waved at them and left the young family in peace. A year later, they had a daughter who was named Olivia. And when the girl was 7 years old, Alex was not. He died horribly and ridiculously. On a winter's evening, he was working late. His car froze. Waiting for a hitchhiker was hopeless, and Alex, without warning anyone, decided to walk home. 3 kilometers, separating the complex from the village, did not seem to him a great distance, but in an hour he would see his beloved wife and daughter. The night was not only frosty but also overcast, and Alex, a city man, quickly lost his way and went in a completely different direction. In general, Alex froze in the field, and the thick snow covered all his tracks. They searched for him for several days, when no one but Barbara had any hope. She believed to the last, believed in a miracle. But it wasn't until spring when Alex's body was found that she calmed down. After burying Alex, Barbara became a different person. It seemed that together with her husband, she put in the coffin of her joy, cheer, and laughter. She became withdrawn and taciturn, shutting herself away. The only place where one could see the old Barbara was at school. With children, she remained kind, patient, and fair. About new relationships after Alex's death, Barbara did not even think about. Local men tried to get close to her, to befriend her, to court her, and even, according to village tradition, to openly woo her. Barbara for many years remained a beautiful young woman with a straight back, a swift gait. But to all attempts to marry her, she answered with a firm refusal. She kicked matchmakers out of the house and sent suitors away. So she lived alone with her daughter Olivia, without asking for help, without complaining about fate. No one saw her tears. Gradually, everyone got used to the fact that she was a lonely, independent, and adamant woman, the eternal widow of her Alex. Olivia was growing up, different from the cheerful and smiling Barbara they remembered her as. It was probably Barbara's fault in many ways that Olivia grew up withdrawn and too serious for a girl. Her seriousness was sullen and directed at people rather than her studies. Almost never did Olivia smile, and no one could hear her laugh. At school, she had a reputation as a savage and a damsel with oddities. Her mother, even though they had no one else, was indifferent to her, showing little affection. There was no intimacy between them, the usual intimacy between a mother and her only daughter. Olivia had always kept a distance between herself and Barbara, and no one, including Barbara herself, was surprised that when she'd barely graduated from high school, Olivia had gone to the city without any special plans. All those years while Olivia was growing up, Barbara had been tormented with guilt toward her daughter. She realized that she didn't like Olivia, didn't give her warmth and tenderness, that all that care about Olivia, delicious food and beautiful clothes. Checking her lessons, it was all very important, of course, but it wasn't the main thing in the relationship between a daughter and her mother. What was the issue here? Was it that her feelings had died with Alex and she'd never been able to rekindle them for her daughter's sake? Or was it that Olivia was growing up too independent and didn't seem to need her mother at all? It probably didn't matter anymore. Olivia, I have a favor to ask of you. Barbara finally made up her mind and began a very difficult conversation with her daughter before she left home. I'm sorry to you. she said, and stopped talking when she looked up and saw the ironic look in Olivia's eyes. "What is it, Mom?" she said with a chuckle. "Let's not do that. Thank God you haven't bullied me all these years or burdened me with errands. And now let's do without playing mother-daughter. Well, what did you want to say?" She continued to look at the confused mother with a grin. "Behave, study. Try not to get knocked up by the first guy you meet. I don't think I missed anything. Oh yes, and most importantly, my dear daughter. I love you very much and I'm always here for you, no matter what happens." So Barbara, having listened to her daughter's tirade, closed her eyes and took a breath. "Well, I guess I deserve it," she said quietly and humbly. "I love you very much, and I am always ready to help you in any way I can." She added, almost in a whisper, "no matter what happens." Olivia went to the city and rarely heard from him. She enrolled in a trade school, and after graduation she found a job with a trading firm. She did not stay long in the city, however, and returned home. Barbara was immensely happy about the return of her daughter, her hedgehog, as she called Olivia to herself. But the hedgehog had become even more prickly in the 4 years she had been away from her mother. "But Mom, what's there to tell?" She finally answered her mother's questions. "My city life didn't work out. Not everyone has to walk on asphalt in heels. Some people need to knead manure with their elbows." Olivia, of course, strongly exaggerated, so disparagingly talking about her small homeland, a village on the outskirts of which a huge cattle breeding complex was constantly growing and expanding. Due to this, in terms of living standards, livability, and size, it had long been not inferior to a small town. For some reason, Olivia was even a little offended by Barbara, who sincerely loved the place where she had lived almost all her life. "It's nice here," Barbara said. "We don't even have that manure lying around the barns. And there is a lot of work, including in your specialty. And we recently got gas, and they built a movie theater. Yes, yes. And birch trees, a river, and so on. We have everything." Olivia ended the conversation decisively. They were back to being mother and daughter. Barbara continued to work at her school, graduating new generations of students. Olivia, an accountant by training, went to work at the cattle farm. But work, like everything else in her life, did not interest her. She remained unsociable. In their house for a long time settled silence and despondency. And then, a few years later, Olivia suddenly changed. She began to stare at her reflection in the mirror for long periods of time, something she had never done before. And she didn't like what she saw. Mom, Olivia suddenly came out of her room one evening and spoke to her mother. "Maybe I should get a haircut. What do you think?" Barbara dropped the TV remote in surprise. Not only was it unexpected that Olivia would ask her to do something like that, but it was also a question of appearance. Olivia had little interest in how she looked. Barbara looked at her daughter, whose hair, long unwashed and overgrown, was twisted at the back of her head in a sloppy bun. "And a daughter," Barbara said with her hands. Of course, that would be wonderful. She struggled to keep from asking why her daughter was paying attention to her appearance. The reason, however, soon became clear. "Andrew's mom works at the mill," Olivia said. "And, we've decided to get married. He doesn't have a place to live with me, of course." She was silent, waiting for her mother's reaction. Barbara sat down on the edge of her chair and tried to cope with the shock of her daughter's categorical statements. "But why didn't you say so in the first place?" she asked. "If that's what you've decided, it's just that it's all so sudden." "Why unexpected?" Smirked ironically at her daughter. "Don't forget, I'm almost 30 years old. How is that unexpected? I mean, I've never even met your man." "I don't even know his name," Barbara said, a little pathetically. "What's there to see? He's just a man, an ordinary man. And his name was Andrew." "Wait," Olivia. Barbara raised her hand and pressed it to her cheek, looking at her daughter fearfully. "Are you pregnant by any chance?" "Well, yes, I am," Olivia hummed. After spending the night without sleep, Barbara got up, determined. "Well, Olivia, if that's the way it's going to be, bring your chosen one. Well, will you bear me a grandson or granddaughter? And we'll live again as a big, friendly, normal family," she said, emphasizing the word normal. However, a normal, and even more so a friendly family did not happen again. It wasn't in Andrew's plans to start a family or to have a child. He was not a local and came to the mill for seasonal work, for which there was a shortage of laborers. The soft-spoken, uncommunicative, aloof Andrew and Olivia, who was a stranger to the place, was the bookkeeper. She was perfect for a casual, easy relationship. Especially since, for all her unsociability and unsociability, Olivia was not spoiled by male attention. Quite handsome, tall, broad-shouldered, with curly hair and a charming smile, Andrew was certainly attractive. A few simple compliments and signs of attention were enough for Olivia to give in to his advances. Olivia was back to her way of life. She sat unkempt, wearing an old tracksuit and biting her fingernail. The only thing new about her appearance was her belly, which was already quite noticeable. Olivia always wore loose uniforms, though, and no one but her mother knew about her situation. "Fiancé?" She grinned back. "The hell he knows, he's gone to look for another bride." "What do you mean?" Barbara sat down. It seemed to her that she was ready for everything, and her daughter couldn't surprise her. But as it turned out, she was wrong. The new news had hit her like a snowball. Olivia, how could it be? Yes, just like that, Olivia jumped up from the chair she'd just been sitting in, leaning against the wall. "Don't start lecturing me, okay? I'm sick of it." "What are you gonna do?" What? Get rid of it? I don't know how. They say it's a long time coming." "What are you talking about?" Barbara, too, got up impulsively and paced the room excitedly. "How can you get rid of your child, my daughter? It's a sin." She made a firm gesture to stop Olivia, who was obviously going to object, and her daughter, surprised by her mother's excitement, remained silent for some reason. "Have the baby," Barbara said heartily, but firmly. And as if stamping her decision, she even banged her fist on the table. We'll raise her. If you don't want to have a baby for yourself, at least have one for me, girl," she added quietly. Olivia shrugged and left the room. 5 months later, a girl was born with bright red hair and wonderful doll-like eyes. The eyes were an amazing gray-blue color, and this color was determined in the baby literally from the first days, and did not change anymore. "What shall we call her?" Barbara asked her daughter. Olivia shrugged. "Ashley." Barbara chanted one of her favorite names. "Ashley it is," Olivia agreed indifferently. The women in the village were treated differently by their strange, atypical family of 3 generations. Some shrugged indifferently, others with obvious incomprehension, but most were sympathetic. Everyone knew Barbara from childhood, remembered how tragically her family life successfully started, how absurd her relationship with her only daughter turned out to be. Missed Olivia because of her grief. The townspeople sighed and smiled involuntarily. But Ashley, it seems, was given to Barbara as a reward. The townspeople added in conversation among themselves. Barbara blossomed again. With the birth of her granddaughter, she, as if she had been mothballed for years, opened up again, studied, learned to smile. Olivia, seeing how her mother had completely dissolved into Ashley, was visibly relieved that she had completely shifted the care of the girl to her, and as if she had forgotten about her daughter. And so it turned out that at the age of 2, Ashley's real mom became her grandmother. "Don't you dare reproach me." Olivia cut her mother off when she tried to talk about Ashley needing a mom. "You weren't the perfect mom yourself, and that's okay. I grew up, and Ashley will grow up just as well as anyone else." Ashley didn't just grow up to be perfect. The girl was some kind of amazing creature. Clear eyes with a round face and a face thickly studded with golden short fuzz. She seemed to be smiling all the time. Even if the girl's lips were compressed, their corners were still raised, and the feeling of a quiet and sly smile did not leave the one who looked at her face. But if the little girl laughed with her shining, the girl grew really pretty, a little snub nose, gray-blue eyes, plump lips, very light, as most redheads' skin. All this promised that the girl would grow up, if not beautiful, then certainly very pretty. But the main adornment of the girl was her hair, not flashy but bright. The red color of her hair was as if slightly accentuated by a light, strong shade. At the same time, the hair glistened and shimmered, as if there were elusive lights running through it. Like many children, her hair was tangled, and when it was time to cut her hair, Barbara looked at her granddaughter and sighed as she put the scissors aside, unable to do the deed. "Well, I cannot," she confessed to her neighbor. "Can you imagine? I can't lift my hand, I can't even cry. It's funny and sinful. You won't believe it. I sit and cry. And I realize that this hair is getting in the way, tangled in it. And I still can't pull myself together." In accordance with the hair, Ashley's character was also, as they say, golden. The girl was very active and mobile, liked to invent mischievous adventures, but at the same time was obedient and manageable. In her, there was not a hint of closedness and sullenness, which from childhood distinguished her mother. Ashley was a mocking and cheerful girl, ringing with silvery laughter every chance she got. What a sparkler, said the kindergarten teacher, where Barbara gave Ashley to when she was 2.5 years old. She herself continued to work at the school. Ashley grew from an adorable baby to an equally adorable girl. Her good fortune had passed all the skin problems and torment that spoiled the lives of so many teenagers. Her loosely curly hair remained her jewelry. At 13 to 14 years on, Ashley, as she, not particularly wise, called in school, slowly looked at most of the boys' peers. True, in adolescence, sympathy is sometimes expressed in a very strange way. On a fall afternoon, Ashley, a sixth grader on the second shift, was carefully carrying a model of a building in her outstretched arms. It was the fruit of days of painstaking work in the evenings. Ashley had assembled it out of paper, matches, paper clips, and more, always thinking of new things to add. "Well, Ashley," she spun around. Barbara laughed. "What's that you've got there?" "This, Grandma, is the house of the future," proudly declared the girl. "And, well, if the future, then of course," said the grandmother respectfully, looking at the tiered construction of the parts, which were fastened in some intricate way. Finally, the intricate layout was ready, and so Ashley, carefully wrapping her precious pyramid around her arms, carefully but quickly stepped towards the school. "Hey, redhead," she heard behind her. "Ashley, why can't you hear me? I'm asking you." The girl stopped and, carefully afraid of dropping her precious cargo, looked back. She did. Standing behind her, smirking, was Justin, a boy from her class. A pretty obnoxious kid. Loved bullying, unless it was guaranteed to be seen by an adult. Justin and Ashley had run into this boy on various occasions, mostly trying to stop another boy's antics. Behind him, the faces of two more of Justin's boyfriends could be seen. Ashley sighed. Justin was a coward, and in another situation Ashley would have no trouble dealing with him, as she had done so many times. But right now she couldn't risk it. She needed to get her layout to school, which she was pretty sure she would win the school competition with. After all, she began in a very calm voice and a friendly smile. "Stay out of this. Please, I don't have time." No time for her. "Look, what's that you've got there?" "Guys, let's go see what she's dragging around." Ashley, in a last-ditch effort to protect her man-made marvel, turned her back to them and put her elbows out. But it didn't help her, of course. Justin shoved Ashley hard in the back, and one of the accomplices slapped his arms. The layout swayed, and as if sadly nodded one last time to its creator, and collapsed into the fall mud. Tears of indignation instantly filled Ashley's eyes and spurted from them. But she didn't smear them on her face. Ashley lunged at her abusers and grabbed the sleeve of her main abuser, Justin. Of course he would be in trouble, but there were 3 boys. There was no telling how the story would have ended for Ashley if there hadn't been a loud shout over their heads. "Come on, kids." They froze. At that, 2 of the boys were grabbed by the collars like kittens by the scruff of their necks. Justin, who was held only by Ashley, looked up and, instantly recognizing the situation, yanked his sleeve from Ashley's fingers and sprinted down the alley as fast as he could. His buddies, suddenly feeling free, followed. "If I see you again, I'll have you on crutches," came their way. Ashley stared at her masterpiece of future architecture. It had fallen apart from the impact with the ground, and the fall mud had already soaked the paper parts and turned them into mush. The girl squatted down and, sighing bitterly, began to collect the remains of the model. Tears rolled out of her eyes and hung ridiculously on her nose. Out of frustration, or rather grief, which was the biggest one so far in her short life. She didn't even immediately remember her unexpected savior. She looked up and met his eyes with a look quite grown up. Standing in front of her was a boy with shaggy blonde hair and a very serious face for a 15-year-old boy. Of course, Ashley knew this boy, as the whole school knew him. His name was Christopher. He was in 9th grade and was the school celebrity. Almost straight A student, captain of the school basketball team. He was the best at computers, already knew how to drive a car, owned a huge German Shepherd, and generally had such an unimaginable set of cool qualities that he seemed like a Superman against the background of his peers, and even those who were older than him. Among other things, Christopher was very handsome, and sports made his figure strong and broad-shouldered, and taught beyond his years. And here was this almost superhuman man now standing over Ashley and looking at her distress. At last he came up and bent to the ground with evident interest. "What have you got there?" he asked. "It's a model of a building of the future." "Well, you know, we have a contest for 6th graders. Well, I wanted to participate so badly. I spent almost a month making it." She was surprised by the guy's interest in the model. "By yourself?" he questioned with disbelief. "By myself, really?" Ashley widened her eyes even more, making them look huge. "Well, my grandmother helped me. 2 roses, but not much. Don't worry, I did most of it myself." "That's great," Christopher said, suddenly delighted. Ashley suddenly remembered her misfortune and tears came to her eyes again. She angrily wiped her face and finally remembered what was important. "Oh, I didn't thank you for driving them away. Help me out. Except it's too late." "Nothing's too late," he declared. "Look at that, 3 pieces almost unharmed." Christopher spoke, carefully shifting the parts onto dry leaves. "This one here, I don't know what you've got. You'll have to completely redo them, of course, but you remember how you glued them together. And these 2 things here, but it's just a matter of replacing a few things. No problem at all." And Christopher suddenly smiled at the girl. "Thanks," Ashley said, confused. "Except I probably won't make it in time anyway. The competition is the day after tomorrow." "You'll make it if you want to," said the savior emphatically. "Your name is Ashley. I believe you're Barbara's granddaughter, right?" Ashley nodded, looking at Christopher mesmerized. "Look, let's put it this way." He thought for a while. "I don't have practice tonight. I'll come over tonight, if that's okay, and help you out a little. Just help me glue and cut. That doesn't count. The idea is yours. Can you do that?" Really, Ashley, unable to believe her ears, continued to stare at Christopher with all eyes. "What a pair of eyes you have," the boy suddenly uttered. "All right, Carrot Top. See you later." Christopher was not deceived, and indeed he came to their house in the evening. Christopher Book and Barbara looked at him in surprise. "Hello, Barbara," the boy replied, embarrassed. "And I'm here to see your Ashley." Barbara looked at him in amazement. "Wow." About the meetings, Olivia's voice came from the back of the room. "It's a little early, daughter," Olivia began. "Sheesh," Barbara shouted sharply and turned to the boy and smiled welcomingly. "Come in, please, Christopher." "You've come," Ashley shouted happily, finding herself on the threshold of the room. "Then I'll definitely make it in time." "But I promise," Christopher said solidly. After working together for 3 hours, the layout was even better. And the next day, Christopher, who lived nearby, carried it to school himself, just in case. Ashley won first place in the contest, and Christopher suddenly realized that he was very pleased to help the brave redhead with the extraordinary clear and pure eyes. A couple of days after their chance encounter, Christopher, for some reason I don't know why, looked into the wing of the school where the little ones were studying. By high school girl standards, he saw Ashley immediately among the other 6th graders. Her red hair and 2 pigtails made her stand out in a big way. It was like she was glowing with some kind of joyful light and illuminating everything around her. At least on a rather cloudy day, it seemed to get brighter around the thin girl, as if an invisible ray of sunlight was coming from her herself. Ashley, the boy called out softly, quite unexpectedly. "Oh," Ashley exclaimed, running up to him and hesitantly stopping a few paces away. "Christopher, hello. I'm so glad to see you." How are you doing? Did you win the contest? In a slightly muffled voice, he asked. He suddenly felt embarrassed. For some reason, Christopher Foken, a high school student, one of the informal leaders of the school, had stuck up for the kids and was standing like a fool in front of a funny red-haired girl. Yeah, she won. First place. Can you believe it? She smiled wide across her mouth, and her toothy grin suddenly made it even brighter. Bloody hell, Christopher said angrily to himself. He wasn't quite sure what was happening to him or why he liked looking at Ashley so much. Well, good for you. Okay, come on, he struggled to find the words. He had never gotten lost in front of teachers or peers before. Christopher turned and took a determined step to the side, but stopped suddenly, turned again to the girl who continued to stand and smile enthusiastically, and added, if you have any problems, ask me. At the same time, he cast a very expressive glance in the direction of the group of boys, led by Justin, whose eyes were as rounded as possible. The news that the red-headed Ashley and the sixth grader were now under Christopher's personal protection spread quickly through the school and reached the ears of even the most uncomprehending. Anyway, immediately Justin quickly realized that it was no longer safe to bully a classmate. There certainly couldn't be any friendship between a sixth grader and a ninth grader like Christopher. But he treated Ashley like the little sister he never had, and she accepted his unobtrusive patronage with delight and pride. They met periodically at school or on the street. Ashley invariably repaid the favor with a cheerful smile. Christopher just couldn't help but smile back. For some reason, the sight of Ashley's red head always lifted Christopher's spirits. And all the things he had planned for the day worked out just fine. He had come to regard the girl as his personal talisman. It got to the point that when he didn't see Ashley at school before his final essay, he ran to her house with 2 red, ruddy apples as a distraction. After graduating from high school, Christopher, after serving in the army, went to the city to attend technical school. After receiving his diploma, he tried to live and work in the city. But local life was not for him. He was always drawn back home, to his native village, to his mother, friends, loved ones, streets and river banks familiar to the smallest details, old and explored by him from top to bottom and from bottom to top trees, and something else that he could neither understand nor formulate. 3 years later, in the spring, he returned home. Christopher walked down the street, breathing in the fresh air filled with the smells of cherry blossoms and lilacs. He listened to the birds singing and felt idiotically, inexplicably happy. The wicket slammed ahead. It was Barbara's house. A slim, girlish figure dressed in skinny jeans and a plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows easily jumped out of the gate. With her back to Christopher, she raised her arms, yanked the hairband from her hair, and her shiny red hair cascaded down her back, backlit by the bright spring sun. It was as if they were creating a glow around the girl. Christopher stopped, utterly amazed. The girl closed the wicket and turned to face him. Her face showed a look of surprise mixed with joy. Her eyebrows crept upward, and he was finally blinded. She flashed him a wide smile. "Ashley, you're here," Christopher exclaimed happily, not believing his eyes. "How have you changed?" "I've grown," she laughed, running up to him. "How do you do?" She held out her narrow palm to him, and he shook it with a kind of awe. The girl seemed to him extraordinary, incredible. More importantly, he realized why he'd missed her all these years. The red-haired Ashley, his mentee, who had grown into a hot bird. "Christopher, can you even hear me?" He finally heard Ashley laugh. She'd been saying something to him for a couple minutes, and he'd been standing in the middle of the street, staring at her and not reacting. "What's wrong with me?" He finally came to his senses. "I said, how long are you staying? Is your mom coming to visit on vacation?" No, Ashley, I'm not visiting. I'm home for good." He finally decided to look her in the eye. "What color are they, blue-gray?" "I don't know." In the bright sunlight, they were almost a heavenly blue. But there's a strand of hair on her forehead, and in the shadows, it looks pearly gray. "That's great," Ashley exclaimed. "Oh, listen, you should come to our prom." "So what if you're older?" "Everyone knows you and remembers you. Do you know how happy everyone would be to see you? Do you?" He didn't know why he said that. "Would you personally be happy to see me?" "Yes," Ashley answered easily and without a second thought. "I'd be very happy." After the prom, which he'd gone to with half the town, he'd suddenly realized that he loved Ashley with a deep, bright, almost sacred love, and maybe he'd loved her all these years without realizing it, without even remembering that she existed. He simply didn't need anyone else but her. Her eyes, her face densely studded with freckles, and her hair flying with flames. "I love you," he told her a week later. "I'll wait for you as long as I have to, as long as I have to. If you want to," he added quietly. "Very much I want to," he heard also a very quiet answer. The fact that something important and special was going on between Christopher and Ashley, who had returned home, became clear to everyone very quickly. Potential suitors quickly fell away from Ashley, and Christopher was sadly crossed off the list of the town's first suitors. All they saw was each other. They sat on a bench above the river cliff. He had his arm around her shoulders, and it felt so good. They both wanted it to last forever. Ashley was about to move on to graduate school, and she was anxious about leaving him. "Go," he said firmly, pulling her tighter against him as if he were contradicting his own words, not really wanting to let her go. "Go as you wish, study, and I will visit you often as I can, and you'll come to see me. Well, I mean to your mother, your grandmother, and me." He looked into Ashley's eyes. "I told you," he went on, silently, as if thinking about what he'd said. "I'll wait for you. And then, Ashley, I have to earn you. You'll be studying, and I'll be working and fixing up my mother's house. I can't just fall on Barbara's head with a young wife." He slid off the bench and knelt down in front of Ashley. Looking into her eyes, he noticed her cheeks flushed, emphasizing all her freckles. "With his wife," she whispered. Of course, he took her chin gently and lifted Ashley's face to a low slump. "You'll marry me, won't you?" She nodded. A tear rolled down her cheek. Ashley left to go to school for economics, and Christopher got serious about developing and renovating his parents' old house. They saw each other as often as possible. With each meeting, they were convinced that their feelings were only growing stronger. 3 years passed. Ashley got her degree and moved back home. The moment had finally arrived when she and Christopher could be together truly as man and woman, as husband and wife. Her whole being yearned for it. She wanted it with every fiber of her being, thought about it constantly. And it made it all the harder to hear the news she'd gotten at home. Ashley. Christopher began a conversation for which he had obviously been preparing for a long time. "My girl," he cleared his throat and shook his head stubbornly, continuing in a firm voice, "we need to wait a little longer." "What?" Ashley asked, confused. "Wait for what?" "Well, to get married," Christopher answered confusedly. "You know, Ashley, I'm sorry, I should have consulted you, of course, but it all happened so fast, before I knew it. But Ashley, it's only for a year. And it's money I won't make here in 5 years. You and I are going to make such a living off of it." He kept saying something. She continued to stare at him incomprehensibly, realizing only one thing: he would not marry her. And they were going somewhere apart again. How much longer? She let out something like a sob. "I can't wait any longer. I don't want to." She wrenched her hands from his, jumped up and pushed him with her foot. "Ashley, sweetheart, love," he mumbled, wrapping his arms around Ashley. "I can't and don't want to wait any longer either, but let's just wait a little longer. Please, my love." He hugged her, whispering some words in her ear. All their longing for each other spoke so powerfully that everything was forgotten: the voice of reason, calculations, promises, and propriety. There were only 2 people left in the world, he and she. And they were together. Christopher signed a 1-year contract to serve in the army. He was a fit, healthy, athletic guy, and he was willingly accepted into one of the units that carried out combat missions in a distant African country. Ashley, of course, did not know all the details of the contract, the main thing, the degree of danger to his life. Giving in to persuasion, and most importantly, being somewhere between heaven and earth, after all that finally happened between them, she, of course, agreed to everything. Ashley stayed waiting for Christopher, and 3 months after he left, she realized she was pregnant. Another month later, Christopher came home early. He came back in a zinc coffin. At Christopher's funeral, Ashley, pale and frightened by dizziness, fainted. She woke up at home on her bed with a wet handkerchief on her forehead. Barbara was sitting a little farther away, scrutinizing her granddaughter's face. "How are you?" she asked what seemed to Ashley to be the most stupid and pointless question. Ashley tried to turn away from the wall. "Don't turn away from me, Ashley," she said firmly. "Let's talk. This is, of course, unimaginable grief. Christopher." Her voice trailed off and she quickly wiped her eyes. "Christopher is such a wonderful young best boy we've ever had. Ridiculous, terribly bitter, but he's a man." and he chose his own path. And that path led him to his death. You must realize that and accept it, and go on your way without Christopher. He's gone. No, Ashley, she stood up resolutely and tried to pull her hands away from the girl's ears, to go on her way. Ashley suddenly opened her eyes and jumped up from the bed. There's no more my way, you know. No. Dead end. A dead end, she sobbed hysterically, cradling her face in her hands. Ashley, my girl Barbara, whose heart was literally breaking at the sight of her granddaughter's grief, put her arm around her shoulders. Believe me, girl, everything passes and this will pass. Time heals. We have to move on. Ashley lifted her tear-stained face to her grandmother and tried to smile a pathetic, shaky smile. Grandma, honey, it's not going to go away, okay? She clutched Barbara to her chest, and her shoulders shook with another attack. With a woman's instinct, with all her experience and selfless, but not very happy life, Barbara immediately realized what was wrong. My God, when did you have time? She gasped. She continued to hold Ashley tightly to her and rocked her as if she were a child. The girl gradually calmed down. Her sobs turned to sobs and mumbling. At last Ashley recovered enough to speak more or less clearly. What are you going to do next? Grandma asked. What do you mean? Ashley asked, puzzled. Have a baby, she said in an unexpectedly firm voice. That's right. Good for you, girl. I'll help you. It was getting dark outside the window, and the two women, old and young, sat hugging each other, trying to process the grief or the unintended, unrecognized joy through their tears. Ashley had a baby boy, healthy and so large that petite Ashley had been in a lot of pain during labor. Olivia had continued to live with her mother and Ashley all these years, but she still managed to exist completely separate from her family. She looked at her grandson blankly and said as if she'd thrown a stone, "It's good that the kid, at least when the time comes, he'll leave someone else, not her." Ashley named her son Jason. The boy was businesslike, solid, always busy with his own little problems. He was like Ashley in character, but in appearance he was becoming more like Christopher every day. Of course, Jason was Ashley's joy, and the only meaning in her life, the anchor that bound her to the present. She'd survived Christopher's death, and the worst months after his funeral only because of the small flame of new life inside her. And even though she had Jason, Ashley was slowly fading away. Skinny as she was literally exhausted. All her brightness was extinguished, faded, exactly as her grandmother Barbara had once been after she'd buried. Chattering, wondering how this family of beautiful, strong women repeated each other's unhappy fate. Jason was 3 years old when Barbara finally couldn't take it anymore. That's it, Ashley, I can't stand to see you go out like a candle, she suddenly declared to her granddaughter. I don't want to see you kicked out of the house. Come on, get ready. Ashley looked at her grandmother wildly, not sure what she meant. What are you looking at me for? The old woman sank down on her. You need to get out of here. You need a change of scenery, a change of job, a change of environment. And it's no good going to the cemetery every day. Are you kicking me out? Ashley asked quietly. Yes, if you want, I am. The old teacher said firmly and changed her tone to one of persuasion. Tanechka, my golden child. It's the right thing to do. It's better this way, believe me, girl. You'll get a job and you'll have a place to live. I've already arranged it. You live, you get distracted. New people, new experiences, new life. Jason came running into the room, and Ashley grabbed the baby and held him to her. Ashley. Grandma looked at her angrily. Stop hiding behind Jason. He's not going anywhere. He's going to stay with me for a while. If things go well, will you take Jason back to your house? Or maybe you'll come home. Tanechka, girl, you've got to try living a different life. I never asked you for anything, but now I'm begging you to go. Ashley listened to her grandmother at first with incomprehension, indignation. What was she talking about? Leaving home? Leaving Jason? Had she lost her mind? Her beloved, always so wise, kind, and infinitely patient grandmother. But gradually the bewilderment gave way to reflection. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her grandmother was right. She really needs to change her life completely and understand what to do next, how and for what to live. 6 months later, after much agony and deliberation, Ashley made up her mind and left for the city. She was taken in by an old friend of Barbara's, also a former teacher, who had a small apartment. From the first day Ashley started looking for a job in her specialty. She called the classifieds, sent her resume. But everywhere she got a polite, but essentially the same response. Sorry, but we can't offer you this vacancy. She realized that objectively she had little chance. Lack of local registration, relatively little work experience, and a young child in the absence of her husband, all this made her candidacy not very attractive to employers. Even though she had a red diploma in economics from a technical school. She was almost despairing and was thinking of returning home when she got an interview at a rather large, apparently well-known in the city firm for the production and sale of furniture. Well, told her in the Department of Human Resources, the place in our accounting department really was. But just this morning we've decided on another candidate. I'm sorry. Ashley was already habitually upset, but suddenly she decided. But maybe there are other jobs available? I really need a job, you know. The HR lady, who had already risen from her seat, sat back in her chair. Maybe it was Ashley's charm, or maybe anger, pity for the young woman. Either way, she gave Ashley a dubious look and stretched out. Well, I don't know. I have an opening, of course. But I don't think you'll accept it. We need an office cleaner. Of course, it was a blow to Ashley's ego. She was a country person and respected any labor, including unskilled labor. Take a few years to learn to come to the city and mop the floor, Ashley thought. She even faltered for a second, but shook her head stubbornly. The money she'd taken with her from home was running out, and she had to either take any job or go back home. I agree. Ashley looked firmly into the HR person's eyes. When can I go to work? You can go to work tomorrow, she replied indifferently. Ashley began to work, and the job itself was not difficult for her. Having been used to labor in the house and vegetable garden since childhood, it didn't seem hard at all. What was discouraging was the attitude of those around her. It was hard for her, accustomed to attention and love, to realize that for others she was an empty place. An appendage to the bucket and mop, who might not even be honored with a simple hello. The office was vast and bustling, with many services and departments. After a while, Ashley remembered by face and by name the managers, leading specialists, and ordinary employees, although for them she was still the girl who was asked to clean, move, or wipe something in addition to her duties. A couple of months had passed, and Ashley was getting to know not only the structure, but also some of the company's business. Olivia, she said one day to the deputy chief accountant, a nervous, rushing woman, "There's something I'd like to tell you." She stopped and looked at Ashley like an insect. "Your girls are throwing documents in the trash when they should be shredding them in the shredder. There's numbers and calculations in there. Just the other day someone threw out a balance sheet, just like that. You can't do that. Are you trying to teach us how to work?" She arched an eyebrow in response. "I don't need you to tell us what we can and can't do. Mind your own business, sweetheart, and stay out of it." Ashley swallowed the undeserved insult and went on with her work. The pay was good, and she was even able to send money to her family a few times. She missed home terribly and traveled there every chance she got. Soon she saw an unusual excitement in the office, running throughout the huge room. Even she, who had nothing to do with the affairs of the firm, realized that something out of the ordinary was going on. After greeting someone by the hand with a word or a nod, a short, dry, middle-aged man in a suit and thin gold-rimmed glasses walked out with a quick, confident stride. Ashley realized from his tense face and frozen, ingratiating smile that this was an unusual visitor. "Who is it?" she asked Aaron, the young accountant, who had been on friendly terms with Ashley lately, and had even chatted with her a couple of times. "Really?" Aaron's eyes widened. "That's Jason Smith, the CFO. You're new here. He's been gone a long time. He's got family in Miami. Well, his daughter was born there, so he took a long vacation." Aaron went on to recount gossip about the CFO's love life. But Ashley was no longer interested, so she thanked Aaron and went on with her work. That afternoon, Ashley stayed late at work after her shift ended. After spending time washing windows and leaving the cleaning of the CFO's office for last, she was startled to see a streak of light under his door. Ashley stood there pondering what she should do. Then the door swung open. Jason Smith stood in the doorway. "Do you want my office?" She heard a soft, slightly husky voice. "Come in. I was just leaving." He turned his back to her, walked to his huge desk and sat down. "Hello," Ashley suddenly decided to address this strict, business-suited man. He looked up and stared at her blankly. He probably would have been just as surprised if a chair had spoken to him. What he asked for some reason. And then, as if realizing, "Excuse me." "Hello." "Jason Smith, I'd like to talk to you," Ashley said. "Or should I say, when I'm taking the trash out of the trash can. And you know I don't mean to gossip or complain, but sometimes I find documents in the trash that could be used against the company's interests if I wanted to." He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Then he stood up, walked around the office, and turned to face Ashley. He was looking at her now, not absent-mindedly, but intently and carefully. "Now," he said, "what kind of documents did you find and what departments? More details, please. And please, sit down." He made an inviting gesture, pointing to a chair in front of his desk. "Jason Smith, once again, I'm not going to complain or set anyone up," Ashley said. "But I've tried to bring this situation to the departmental staff and no one wants to hear me out. And we're talking about personal data, accounting data, your company's financials, I think." Ashley continued, noticing that the man was listening to her very carefully, that we need to tighten control over the handling of documents, especially their disposal. It's not right that I, a simple cleaning lady, know, for example, what the company's revenue was last month and what the current penalty for tax arrears is. Jason Smith leaned back in his chair, his gaze now expressing keen interest. "But I think you're being modest," he said. "You're not an easy cleaner, to say the least. What's your name, by the way?" "Ashley," she said, and looked him in the eye. "And I understand from what you've said that you know about accounting." "Ashley, where are you from?" Jason Smith asked. "Well, I'm an accountant by training," she said. "I don't have a college degree, but I graduated with honors and worked for a couple of years as an economist at a large plant." Seeing that he continued to listen to her attentively and interestedly, she suddenly made up her mind. "I can't say that I'm such an outstanding specialist, but I also noticed errors in the wires, for example." Jason Smith became wary. For example, your accountant uses account 40 goods to record annual production, but you should use account 43 finished goods. Then there will be no error in cost accounting. After all, you already paid a penalty of almost $70,000 last quarter for this error. But nothing has changed. Jason Smith put his gold-rimmed glasses back on his nose and interlocked his fingers. "Amazing. Interesting things you're telling me. A simple cleaning lady, Ashley." But he took a pen and began to write something quickly in his day planner. "You are now clearly out of place, finishing your work today, and I expect you here in my office by 9 o'clock tomorrow." All of this was said in a tone that had no hint of doubt or suggestion that she herself might want something different. The next day, Ashley, dressed in her best pantsuit, to the amazement of the entire office, sat in front of the door to the CFO's office at the gesture of the receptionist. She realized that she was inviting her to come inside. Ashley opened the office door. Jason Smith was sitting at his desk talking on the phone. Yes, exactly what we need," she heard him say. "Perfect for you in every way. And no strings attached. That's all right, I'll call you back." He disconnected the phone and made an inviting gesture with a smile. "Please, sit down, Ashley's cleaning lady." He was quiet for a moment and then continued. "You are certainly out of place here, it's quite obvious. I have a proposition for you. We have a sales branch. Would you like to be the chief accountant there?" The offer struck Ashley so much that it even seemed absurd to her. She looked at him questioningly, trying to see if he was joking. The man sitting across from her was a solid, serious man who clearly didn't have time for such silly pranks. "Me? Suddenly the chief accountant of the cleaning ladies? Chief accountants, and even without higher education. It doesn't happen like that." She looked at her interlocutor in panic. "Don't be so frightened," Jason Smith said. He stood up, walked around the table, and sat down across from Ashley. "Chief accountant is a big word for it. In fact, the firm is small, with only 3 employees and only 1 accountant. He's both chief and staff in one person, so to speak. And I've already made sure that you are quite wealthy as an accountant. By the way," he smiled, "about our conversation yesterday. I've already given orders to check the order of accounting entries. And you know you were right. There are a lot of mistakes, so you should not doubt your own abilities. Wouldn't you agree? Wouldn't you agree?" He glanced at his watch, and then at Ashley, clearly expecting her to answer immediately. When he saw her hesitation, he struck the final blow. "I'm sorry, I forgot the most important thing," he smiled charmingly. The money question. You are, of course, interested in the question of salary. But let's start with a trial period to agree on $100,000 a month, and then we'll see the results. Do we have a deal? Ashley, who had never received even a quarter of that amount, was stunned. $100,000 a month. To buy good winter clothes and shoes, to repair the roof of the house, and finally to pay for her grandmother's knee surgery, which she had long dreamed of. All these desires swirled in her head. If she could earn so well, she could really help her family. A chance like that she might never get again. She should give it a try. She should be able to do it. I agree, she said quietly, and smiled. Thank you, Jason, for your trust. He looked at Ashley carefully, and for some reason he lowered his eyes, tracing some lines on the desk calendar. It was as if he was hesitating about something. At least it seemed to her, for some reason, that he was confused and thoughtful for a few seconds. But it passed quickly. And in front of her again sat, confident in each of his decisions, of the leader. Well, excellent, he said. From tomorrow you will start your duties. I'll make sure you're up to speed. Ashley threw herself into her work with all her heart. She was a good bookkeeper, and she performed her duties with integrity. But pathological honesty, gullibility, and unsophisticated style are not the best qualities for the chief accountant of a commercial firm with an unclear reputation. She really for a long time did not notice that in parallel with the daily official activities of their firm was some barely noticeable work. Sometimes she came across documents with contents that embarrassed her. For example, one day she found invoices that she had signed earlier as chief accountant, but the recipients had been changed after she had been given large sums of cash to pay for what she was told were some unforeseen expenses. She decided to talk to the holding company's CFO. But Ashley kindly explained to Jason Smith she is no longer a child. It's a common practice. Any commercial firm takes some of its income out of tax. But it doesn't concern you. I have to tell you, work in peace. By the way, you've got a big job coming up, opening a line of credit. You remember? Yes, of course, Jason Smith, Ashley said thoughtfully. I'm preparing the paperwork. Good, he smiled thinly. And if all goes well, you'll receive a substantial bonus 3 months after the firm receives the loan. 2 men in uniform entered Ashley's office without knocking. All documents of the firm were arrested, and Ashley herself was accused of large-scale fraud and sent to a pre-trial detention cell. A few days later, Ashley was summoned to meet with her appointed defense attorney. Hello, Ashley, the man said with an embarrassed cough and continued in a more forceful tone, my name is Samuel Brown, and I'm your attorney. I will defend you at your trial, and I will try to. He clearly stumbled and was again embarrassed. I'll try to get the charges against you dropped, or at least part of them. He looked at her with a long, attentive stare, as if trying to penetrate her soul. She averted her eyes indifferently. Ashley, he came to the table and sat down across from her. This isn't going to work. You and I need to establish a rapport, a trust. Otherwise, it's not going to work, you know. Tell me, you're innocent of what you're accused of. What does it matter if I'm guilty or not? She spoke tiredly. Who cares but me? It matters. It matters to me very much, he answered excitedly. Though I'm sure you're innocent anyway. I knew it as soon as I saw you. She looked at the man with some interest and smiled a little. As soon as you saw me, she interjected ironically. I wonder how you can work as a lawyer if you make such conclusions based on looks alone. It's ridiculous. But he was clearly embarrassed again. I'm not much of a lawyer. To be honest, Ashley grinned bitterly. And neither am I the chief accountant. But even though I'm not very experienced and I don't know much about economics, he continued stubbornly, I'll do my best to defend you, or at least get your sentence reduced. He tried to say the last word as softly and quietly as possible, but Ashley still flinched as if struck. So you are charged with accessory after the fact. Ashley listened to his voice and everything he said. The charges and the articles of the criminal code that corresponded to those charges coalesced into a giant, sticky web in the center of which she, a poor, foolish, naive butterfly, fluttered. Samuel Brown, Ashley's lawyer, fought the trial like a knight without fear or reproach. And he himself, in his imagination since childhood very rich, imagined himself the savior of Ashley, a beautiful lady who was captured by an evil dragon. And he is the only one who can protect and save her. He spent more than one sleepless night to understand the intricacies of the firm's accounting, mountains of documents and invoices, real and fictitious transactions. As a result, having spent several weeks and almost all his savings, He proved Ashley's non-involvement in most of the violations, and the heaviest charge was dropped, but he still could not get her full release. She got 2 years in juvie. Before she left for juvie, Ashley met with her lawyer. She had already come to terms, lived with her fate, and like the women of her family, accepted her fate. Her red hair was braided into 2 braids. Her face was scrubbed clean without the slightest trace of makeup, and she had lost weight and looked more like a frightened 14-year-old girl than a grown woman with years of darkness ahead of her. She seemed almost saintly to Samuel. He'd realized long ago, admitted to himself, that he loved Ashley with all his heart. He was afraid to give away his feelings, but he wanted to at the same time. He couldn't decide whether it would be better for Ashley to know that he loved her, or whether he shouldn't embarrass and disturb her before he left. Ashley looked up at him with haggard eyes and smiled involuntarily. How cute was he after all, her lawyer? Tall, a little stooped, angular but broad-shouldered, with thick, long, uncut blonde hair that kept falling over his eyes, and he kept tucking it back. There was something inexplicably native about him to her. He was a real man, the way her mom said her father had been, the way she remembered Christopher. Ashley drove some incomprehensible excitement inside and spoke up. "Samuel Brown, I am grateful for everything you have done for me. I realize that if it weren't for you, I would have gotten a much longer sentence. I don't owe you the 4 years of juvie you got off me. I probably owe you my life. I know that, and I'll never forget it. But it's already happened, and there's nothing you can do about it, and I'll have to disappear from life for 2.5 years. Wait, don't interrupt me, Sasha. Can I call you that?" He quickly nodded his head in agreement. "You have already done so much for me. Do one more thing. You know I have a family in the village, my mother, grandmother, and son. I don't want them to know what happened to me. Our family wasn't happy enough as it was. And now this. My grandmother is much closer to me than my mom. That's just the way it is. I'm just afraid she's not going to make it through this. Jason. Yeah, I mean, sure, kids get used to everything. But I don't want him to see me in jail, in these clothes, like this. No, not like this." She choked with sobs, but making an effort to restrain herself, angrily wiped her tears and continued. "I wrote the letter. I made up a whole story. I lied about everything. Of course, Grandma won't believe it. But if this letter is brought by a good, sincere person, such as you, Sasha, she might listen, understand, accept and agree to wait. I know I can't. I have no right to hang this on you. But I have no one else. And I can only trust you. I beg you, Sasha, if you can, do this for me." She handed him a few folded sheets of notebook paper, written in small handwriting. Samuel gently took the sheets from her hands and looked into her eyes. "Ashley, Tanetka." He swallowed convulsively. "I'll be waiting for you." Ashley had stood her ground, endured, survived 2 years, keeping herself as a person, pure and whole. She's learned a lot, rethought a lot. She saw and learned things she would never have seen or known in a normal life. Many of the things she saw she would have preferred to never experience. But that's how life happened. She got out of the colony and went to the only place on earth where she was welcome, at least as she hoped, home. On a clear autumn day, she got off the bus and wandered towards her grandmother's house, trying not to be recognized. "Hello, Grandma," she said simply to Barbara, who was furiously beating the dust out of the mat with a stick. The very old woman looked up at her, dropped the stick, and woke up for the time being. So much chemistry. Suddenly a question hammered in Ashley's brain, the answer to which she couldn't remember in any way. Barbara managed her weakness, swiped the tears from her eyes, and slowly approached Ashley. Quietly, she asked her granddaughter and hugged her as she had as a child. They shoulders shook, but quietly. Again, like as a child, coaxed her grandmother in Ashley's ear on her back, her shoulders, her head. "Quiet girl, my golden girl. It's nothing. Ashley, nothing. Dirt doesn't stick to gold." Ashley looked into Barbara's eyes. There was nothing but love in them. Ashley pressed her grandmother's hands to her face and sighed. She was home. And Jason, she suddenly realized when both of them had calmed down from their first excitement. "Where's Jason?" "Grandma, it's like kindergarten." "You're Jason," Barbara replied. "I'm too old to keep up with your father, you know. Your mother got smart and got a job. So we put him in the garden. A long time ago, about 2 years ago. Yes, he's fine there. He's already the main man there, she laughed. He's probably forgotten all about me, Ashley said fearfully. Well, there you go, she said. Who would let him forget you? We talk about you every day, and he's never parted from your picture. And Andrew keeps telling him his mom's coming back. Mom will be here soon, mom this and mom that. Andrew? Who's Andrew? Ashley looked at Barbara in surprise. Well, there's this new good man. We've been having a hard time without him all this time. You'll get to know him soon enough, she said with a sly look at her granddaughter. By the way, remember where the kindergarten is? Well, it's time to pick up Jason. You go, girl, get your son, you go. Jason had grown and changed a lot since the last time she'd seen him. Ashley didn't even recognize him right away. She stood under an old birch tree by the fence of the kindergarten and waited, not knowing what to do. Jason ran out of the kindergarten gate and sprinted off, not paying any attention to the lone figure standing under the tree. Hi, he shouted to someone, spreading his arms happily. Ashley followed Jason with her eyes and was surprised to see him running toward the man, squatting down to him and spreading his arms wide as well. It was a man. In the twilight of the fall evening, Ashley could only see the outline of the figures and the bright blue stain of a jacket. After a while, she realized that it wasn't so much the twilight as the tears that blurred her eyes. Jason, she whispered to her son. Jason, meanwhile, ran up to the squatting man and hung around his neck. The man wrapped his arms around the baby, lifted him to his full height above the ground, and began to spin him on his axis. It was obvious that this ride had been performed many times before and was familiar to both of them. Jason squealed enthusiastically, and the man laughed. Ashley closed her eyes and pressed her back against the trunk of the old birch tree. For a few moments she thought she recognized Christopher in the man. And going crazy, she thought sadly, swallowing the tears that continued to flow. The merry fiddling continued between the boy and the man, accompanied by children's laughter, squeals, and delighted squeals. The man also continued to laugh and finally said, "That's it. Jason, Christopher, stop the pampering or your pants and shirt will go again." The man's voice sounded familiar to Ashley. She squinted, trying to make him out through the fall twilight and the tears in her eyes. Finally, she recognized the blonde, disheveled hair, the tall, slightly bent figure. It was Samuel Brown, her lawyer. Jason spotted her first. He stopped in his run, as if he had run into an invisible wall, crouched down with his hands on his knees, and leaned over and rushed toward her. "Mom, did you make it?" Ashley squatted down, wrapped her arms around the fleeing Jason, and pulled him against her, breathing in her son's dear, beloved scent hard and tight. The smell she'd dreamed about every night for 2 years. Samuel walked slowly toward her. He squinted myopically. "Hello, Ashley," he said in a voice hoarse with excitement. "Hello, Sam," she replied, also feeling a lump in her throat. "You've gotten even more beautiful, Ashley. I've been expecting you and it's really good to see you." "Glad." Just glad, she looked up at him with a smile. "And here I am, Sam, seeing you, just happy." She brought her face close to Samuel's and kissed his cheek. They walked down the street, rustling the gold and red leaves that carpeted the ground. Jason held onto his mother's hand with one hand and Samuel's with the other, and walked cheerfully between them, jumping up and down every chance he got, making sure to lift as many fallen leaves into the air as he could. It was extremely exciting. And Jason was perfectly content, especially because neither his mother nor Uncle Sam ever scolded him for his outright hooliganism. They had no time for each other, looking into each other's eyes and smiling.